Wheels turning against the rough terrain punctuated their journey, a steady reminder of the road ahead. Out of nowhere, Belinda's voice broke the silence. Her tone carried a note of surprise as she gestured toward a figure in the distance. The sight had caught her off guard, and she called out, questioning who it might be. Ghislaine's gaze followed her line of sight. Recognition flickered in his eyes, and he paused for a moment, the faintest hint of astonishment crossing his face. As realization settled, he quietly acknowledged the figure in question. It was his father. The Perdium castle stood tall against the gray sky, exuding a sense of majesty tinged with the somber hues of time. Inside the meeting room, a man firmly suggested reducing the number of troops. His idea was met with immediate objection, as another pointed out that it would make maintaining the defensive line almost impossible. Amid the growing tension, someone proposed seeking support from Rayfold to reinforce their forces. An older man raised his hand to his forehead, his expression pensive. The realization struck him Rayfold had already cut funding, prioritizing its own military strength and stockpiling resources. His explanation deepened the unease in the room. Albert, Perdium's treasury manager, stood silently, his stern expression reflecting the weight of the situation. His features showed deep contemplation, as if calculating crucial strategies to protect the territory. Homer, Perdium's administrative chief, bowed his head slightly, his eyes filled with concern. His aged features bore the marks of experience, reflecting the heavy burden he carried for the survival of their land. Homer finally broke the silence, reasoning that they had no other choice but to rebuild the garrison in the forest which had been half destroyed during the October battle. He acknowledged that even with reduced forces, they might temporarily ease the pressure. Another man voiced his disagreement, expressing his concern about the heightened risks that such troop reductions could bring. The room descended into heated debate, with tensions mounting as they grappled with the looming consequences of their decisions. Ghislaine looked up, his gaze a mixture of determination and exhaustion. As the young lord of Perdium, he silently reflected on how unchanged those around him seemed to remain. Ghislaine allowed a faint smile to form, his eyes betraying a thoughtful expression. Before him stood familiar figures: Randall, the captain of the Perdium Knight Order; Albert, the chief treasurer of Perdium; and Homer, Perdium's chief administrator. A thought crossed his mind, vivid and nostalgic. He pondered how long it had been noting that for a Grand Duke of Perdium, it might have felt like mere months, but for a mercenary it had been decades. His demeanor shifted, and his tone turned cold as he acknowledged the effort of one of the figures present. His words carried the weight of recognition for their hardship. Yet, despite the control in his voice, an emotional whisper escaped his lips, almost unintentionally, as he referred to his father. The man clad in armor bore a resolute expression, his deep, unwavering eyes reflecting his authority. This was Count Zwalter Perdium, whose presence exuded unshakable dominance. His response was brief, a simple nod followed by a single curt sound, acknowledging the moment. His gaze lingered, silently questioning his son's expression. Ghislaine's thoughts wandered as he observed his father. Memories of childhood surfaced, moments of struggle with his father's strict and rigid demeanor. Those memories, vivid and deeply etched, carried a lasting impact. However, a sense of understanding gradually replaced his initial resentment. In his heart, he affirmed a new realization, accepting what he once could not comprehend. Count Perdium sat with a calm yet commanding presence, his silhouette a testament to the burdens he bore. The weight of the territory, its struggles, and its survival rested heavily on his shoulders, reflecting the essence of his responsibility. He raised a cup of tea and shifted his gaze toward his son. His words, measured and deliberate, pointed out that he had noticed Ghislaine's absence for about a week. Ghislaine, maintaining a calm demeanor, acknowledged the remark, explaining that he had traveled to Rayfold's. The Count's gaze sharpened momentarily, carrying a hint of sternness. His silent concern was evident as he contemplated his son's actions. His internal reflection highlighted his hope that this visit did not bring unnecessary trouble. Ghislaine, resolute in his stance, quietly reassured his father that no issues had arisen during his journey. Albert, who had observed the exchange, sipped his tea before addressing Ghislaine with a light-hearted remark. Though his tone carried a hint of jest, his words acknowledged the surprising news he had heard about Ghislaine's victory in a duel against Kane, which also reportedly earned him some monetary gain. Albert's expression turned stern, his eyes scrutinizing as he asked, probing further. He questioned whether Ghislaine had gone to Rayfold's merely to gamble. The young man raised an eyebrow slightly, his tone calm as he responded that his visit had been for business discussions with Amelia. Yet in his mind he scoffed at the notion, internally dismissing the accusation with disdain. To him, gambling was a foolish term; he considered it investment. Homer, wearing a worried expression, reminded Ghislaine once more. His concern was evident as he repeated his usual counsel, urging the young lord to consider his actions carefully, given his role as the future heir of Perdium. Ghislaine offered a faint acknowledgement, his tone indifferent, assuring Homern that there was no need to worry. Homern clenched his teeth in frustration, his thoughts filled with irritation. Despite his stern advice, he felt ignored. His mind questioned how he could avoid concern when faced with such dismissal. Amid the growing tension, Count Perdium's voice cut through the room, its depth and authority silenced everyone. His single word, curt but commanding, brought immediate stillness. The Count's sharp gaze fell upon Ghislaine, his brow furrowing slightly as he remarked that he had heard some intriguing rumors about the young man's actions during his absence. Ghislaine's surprise was evident as he looked back at his father, his expression puzzled. The Count's tone turned sharp as he directly addressed the incident he had heard about. He inquired whether Ghislaine had executed Jamal and Philip for their alleged betrayal in attempting to sell Alina. Ghislaine's eyebrow arched slightly as the memory surfaced. The events surrounding Jamal and Philip replayed vividly in his mind, accompanied by a mocking tone in his thoughts. Randolph, the captain of the Knights, let out a faint chuckle and shook his head. He interjected with a sarcastic remark, claiming there was no way the young lord had handled their executions entirely on his own. In his opinion, the story had likely been exaggerated, as those men had probably turned on each other, with Ghislaine merely delivering the final blow. Lost in thought, Ghislaine pondered Randolph's perspective. He acknowledged that while the captain knew Jamal and Philip were traitors, the notion of his own knights being slain by his hand likely unsettled him. To avoid further complications, Ghislaine responded vaguely, his tone light. Randolph smirked, his expression smug, as if his earlier assumptions had been validated. Count Perdium stood silently, his gaze heavy with contemplation. Ghislaine lifted his eyes, their cold glint reflecting a calculated resolve. His father's voice pierced the stillness, its sharpness laced with an unexpected acknowledgement of his actions. For a brief moment, Ghislaine felt something indescribable stir within him. The Count's composure remained steady, his gaze resolute. His voice carried a definitive weight as he emphasized the most crucial outcome, that Elena was still alive. Ghislaine remained silent, lowering his head as if lost in thought. His mind, however, reflected on the moment with clarity. For the first time he realized his father had praised him. Gathering his determination, Ghislaine looked up, his gaze steady, as he asked if he might make a single request. Count Perdium raised an eyebrow slightly, his tone calm yet inquisitive, as he responded to his son's question about the nature of the request. Homern furrowed his brows and spoke in a stern voice, warning that if Ghislaine planned to request a reward, he would put an immediate stop to it. Randolph nodded in agreement and chimed in, urging Ghislaine to consider all the trouble he had caused. Anger flared as Randolph listed the young lord's misdeeds, selling military supplies to fund gambling, setting fire to the main gate to roast a military horse, and melting down all the armor to forge some so-called legendary sword. Ghislaine looked at Randolph with mild annoyance, thinking to himself how noisy and bothersome the accusations were. He then turned to his father and stated calmly that he wanted a specific permission. His father, surprised, questioned what kind of permission Ghislaine was seeking. Standing tall, Ghislaine's eyes filled with determination as he clearly declared his intent to explore the beast forest. The room fell into stunned silence as every gaze fixed on him. Shock was evident on their faces, their expressions mirroring their disbelief. Ghislaine allowed a faint smile to play on his lips, his eyes glinting with confidence and challenge. His determination was unshaken, as though he had already braced himself for every obstacle. With his light smile unwavering, he glanced sharply at the guards and remarked sarcastically that his father had already refused. Meanwhile, Gillian sat comfortably in his chair, one arm casually draped over the side. His tone was calm as he commented that the Count had lost his temper and started yelling at him. Belinda, the maid nearby, responded in a firm tone, pointing out that it was only natural. The forest was full of monsters, and there was nothing in it worth risking their lives for. Ghislaine turned his gaze toward Gillian and asked in a serious tone whether he had heard about his plan from Belinda. Gillian's reply was steady as he affirmed that he had. He added that he suspected Ghislaine intended to fund the exploration of Beast Forest using money obtained from Rayfold's daughter. The older man's expression grew grave, his voice heavy with authority as he described the forest's reputation a place of no return, shrouded in mystery and avoided by all. Its infamous name had spread far and wide. Ghislaine let out a faint laugh, his sharp eyes gleaming as he confidently agreed with the man's assessment. There was indeed nothing in the forest worth entering for, but still. He stood, turned his back, and began to walk away. His voice rang out, resolute and unwavering. It was time to begin. Belinda, alarmed, rushed after him, shouting for him to stop. Her voice rose as she questioned how he could proceed after being explicitly denied permission. Ghislaine turned his head slightly, a smirk playing on his lips. His response was cold and deliberate as he clarified that he never actually needed his father's permission, it was merely a formality. This was something that had to be done. Why venture into a monster-infested forest? Standing amidst the tense atmosphere, Ghislaine's calm demeanor masked the truth. He simply stated that it was the only place where he could turn his financial situation around. Belinda, her face etched with fear, tried to dissuade Ghislaine from his dangerous plan. Despite her efforts, his unwavering determination rendered her powerless, leaving her to watch in silent resignation. Ghislaine internally decided to keep his intentions hidden, understanding that revealing them now would only complicate the situation. His gamble was driven by the colossal gemstone vein deep within the forest, a risk he believed was worth taking despite the uncertainty of success. In his mind, the shimmering image of precious gems represented hope for a transformed future. Yet he was fully aware of the terrifying reality ahead: the Forest of Death, a place from which no one had ever returned alive. This forest held the legendary runestone, a rare orb brimming with magical energy, coveted by mages for its unparalleled value. Essential for crafting magical tools like barriers, magic circles, and spell scrolls, runestone was indispensable in both alchemy and magical research. In a previous life, it had been Duke Delphine who uncovered the precious deposit of runestone. Now, Ghislaine alone possessed this critical information. His eyes reflected a deep resolve as he saw this as the key to changing his fate. The maid, unable to suppress her anger, glared sharply at him. Her disapproval was clear in her demeanor as she exhaled a sharp breath, a non-verbal protest against his recklessness. However, she reluctantly agreed to follow his plan. Gillian also acknowledged the directive with a composed response, indicating his willingness to comply. Ghislaine regarded their agreement with a simple affirmation. He then tasked Belinda with heading to the nearest guild to hire 200 mercenaries. Belinda hesitated, her expression laced with skepticism as she questioned whether spending the money Ghislaine had risked his life to acquire was a wise decision. Meanwhile, Gillian raised a cautionary note. He expressed his concern that mercenaries, being a chaotic and unreliable group, could betray their employer and seize everything for themselves. Ghislaine remained unfazed, his cold gaze reflecting his confidence. Without hesitation, he silently reinforced his resolve, undeterred by their apprehensions. From his vantage point above the castle, Ghislaine gazed at the distant landscape with a contemplative expression. He turned toward Gillian, his voice calm but decisive, acknowledging the need for caution. He agreed that blindly trusting mercenaries would be unwise and suggested they carefully handpick only those who could prove genuinely useful. Gillian, startled by the unexpected suggestion, hesitated before seeking clarification on what Ghislaine truly meant. Ghislaine calmly explained his plan, his eyes reflecting unshakable determination. He intended to recruit the most skilled mercenary group from the small teams in the north. Gillian's reaction was immediate, his eyes widened in disbelief as he realized what Ghislaine meant. He recognized the name instantly, and his voice, now heavy with unease, hinted at his fear. He identified the group as the infamous Mad Dogs of the North. The Cerberus mercenaries, notorious for their unrivaled combat prowess and wild temperament, were infamous for betraying their employers when the odds were no longer in their favor. Their emblem, a three-headed hound, embodied chaos and unrestrained violence, a fitting symbol for the terror they brought to battlefields. Standing firm, Ghislaine silently acknowledged the challenges ahead. The name of the Cerberus mercenaries crossed his lips again, this time with an air of defiance, as he resolved to face them despite their fearsome reputation. As his group advanced toward their destination, the majestic view of the valley stretched out before them, its imposing presence a harbinger of the trials they were about to face. Ghislaine, standing amongst his companions, conveyed his unyielding resolve to bring the Cerberus mercenaries under control. As at the edge of the Zimbar territory lay the chaotic camp of the Cerberus mercenaries. The camp bustled with activity as the mercenaries prepared for their next battles, their unruly nature evident in every movement. From a distance, Ghislaine and Gillian approached on horseback. One of the Cerberus lookouts, peering through a spyglass, noticed their approach. He chuckled mockingly, finding amusement in what he perceived as their naivety. Another mercenary joined the first, sharing the view through his own spyglass. A wicked grin spread across his face, matching the rising tension in the camp, which now felt like a storm about to break. One of the mercenaries remarked that the approaching figure resembled a young noble, already contemplating the potential wealth they might extort. Yet before he could act, a massive hand emerged from the shadows, striking him down with brutal force. The camp descended into chaos as screams of pain filled the air. One by one, the mercenaries fell to the unexpected assault. The remaining few, paralyzed by fear, retreated, unwilling to challenge the overwhelming power of the attacker. Their faces betrayed their terror, realizing they faced a force beyond their comprehension. Gillian moved effortlessly through the fray, his immense strength cutting down the mercenaries with precision. The tension in the air thickened with each of his steps, as even the slightest movement sent shockwaves of fear through the battlefield. Among the defeated, one mercenary found himself in Gillian's grip, his face twisted in terror. He struggled to comprehend the situation, his voice faltering as he weakly questioned the brutal force that had overtaken their camp. Without a word, Gillian demonstrated his overwhelming strength, hurling the mercenary aside like a discarded object. The others, witnessing the sheer force, began retreating in fear, terrified that they might be next. A sharp slash cut through the air, cleaving two enemies before him. The powerful attack shook the ground, and the unlucky targets crumpled in agony. The remaining mercenaries stared in horror at the scene before them. One of them stammered, his face pale, as he muttered in disbelief, "What the hell is this?" None dared step forward, their fear etched across their faces. From a distance, a burly figure emerged through the rain. The sound of falling droplets mixed with the frantic cries of the guards. One shouted for the group to prepare for battle, demanding to know the identity of the approaching figure. Another yelled, his voice breaking, "Are you insane?" A mocking voice rang out, tauntingly noting the arrogance of the new arrival. The speaker scoffed, commenting on the figure's noble appearance but warning against acting so recklessly, no matter their lineage. A man with a cold expression strode forward, his presence heavy and foreboding. Each deliberate step seemed to press down on the air around him, amplifying the tension. His deep, menacing voice carried a dire warning: there would be no return home alive. The man's icy gaze stayed fixed ahead as silence enveloped the surroundings. Only the sound of his measured steps echoed, underscoring the mounting danger and unease in the air. A young man approached on horseback, his red cloak billowing in the wind. His posture exuded confidence, and his cold, calculating eyes swept over the scene. The steady rhythm of the horse's hooves against the ground added to the charged atmosphere. Ghislaine brought his horse to a halt. His piercing gaze locked onto the figures before him as he issued a decisive command. His voice carried authority. Leaving no room for argument, he demanded silence and ordered them to summon their commander immediately. Ghislaine sat astride his horse, his sharp eyes scanning the camp ahead. Amid the tense atmosphere, a towering figure emerged from the midst of the soldiers, drawing attention with his cold and commanding presence. Tilting his head slightly, Ghislaine's gaze narrowed, scrutinizing the figure before he spoke with direct authority, demanding to know who the commander was. The man stood silently for a long moment, a mocking smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. A quiet laced with menace escaped him, intensifying the oppressive air around them. With a sneer, the man's sharp eyes glinted with disdain as he commented on the apparent recklessness of the young noble. The sound of chains clinking together added to the ominous tension, heralding impending danger. Tightening his grip on the chains, the man's half-smile turned sinister. His deep voice resonated like a warning as he declared it was time to teach the boy a lesson. The chains whipped forward with brutal force, the spiked end aimed directly at Ghislaine. As the weapon hurled through the air, a thunderous voice accompanied it, proclaiming, "This is what responsibility looks like." The sheer power of the attack caused the air to tremble, radiating a sense of overwhelming dominance across the area. The spiked mace, glowing with an intense blue light, hurtled toward Ghislaine with deadly precision. Yet despite the looming danger, he remained calm, his expression unflinching. Just as the mace was about to strike, a powerful slash from behind severed the chains. The force of the blow diverted the attack, leaving the weapon suspended momentarily in midair before falling inert. Behind Ghislaine stood Gillian, his sword still glowing faintly from the force of his strike. His cold gaze locked onto the attacker, a silent warning that any further aggression would not end well. Nearby, two mercenaries recoiled in shock, their eyes wide with disbelief. One stammered, struggling to comprehend what he had just seen, marveling that Gillian had managed to cut through the chains with his sword. The mace fell heavily to the ground with a deafening crash, scattering dirt and rocks. The severed chains rendered the attack completely ineffective. A cold smile curved Ghislaine's lips as his sharp eyes gleamed. He murmured to himself, almost as if reflecting aloud, that words were clearly useless against these people. Turning away, his expression remained composed but icy. In a measured tone, he issued a curt command, instructing Gillian to inflict just enough damage to incapacitate without killing. From behind, Gillian, his sword still at the ready, responded with unwavering resolve, affirming the order with a firm acknowledgement. Gillian charged forward, his sword radiating an intense glow. With a precise slash, he severed the chain of the enemy's weapon, producing a sharp, metallic clatter. The enemy staggered back, his face betraying shock and disbelief. Seizing the broken chain, Gillian swung it with overwhelming force, sending his opponent hurtling into the air. The man spun wildly before crashing to the ground, all under the horrified gaze of his comrades. Gillian swung the chain powerfully once more, its spiked mace glowing brightly with energy as it flew through the air at incredible speed. His expression remained steadfast, his sharp eyes unflinching against the enemy's desperate retaliation. In one decisive strike, Gillian dispatched the opponent before him. The arc of his glowing blade cut through the enemy's armor, eliciting a cry of pain as the man collapsed lifelessly to the ground. The remaining enemies charged forward, shouting angrily. One of them yelled that they wouldn't hold back just because he was a noble. Yet Gillian stood firm, the severed chain in his hand spinning ominously, ready to counter any who dared approach. He moved with lightning speed, closing the distance in an instant. His sword struck the enemy's chain weapon with precision, shattering their defenses entirely. The mercenary, raising his weapon in vain, was utterly powerless against the force of Gillian's attack. With a swift and powerful motion, Gillian brought his blade down, slicing through the enemy's armor with devastating strength. The impact sent the opponent flying into the air, their armor shattering under the sheer force of his assault. The soldier landed heavily on the ground with a resounding crash. Around him, the remaining mercenaries froze in stunned silence. Their fear was palpable as they witnessed Gillian's destructive might firsthand. Standing tall amidst the chaos, Gillian's cold gaze swept over the battlefield. His face reflected unwavering resolve, while a faint blue aura shimmered around him, a testament to the immense power that lay within. The enemy soldiers tightened their grips on their weapons, their eyes tense and filled with fear. Their silhouettes trembled under the crimson light, fully aware of the overwhelming difference in power they faced. Ghislaine's footsteps echoed steadily on the ground, the sound carrying a commanding weight. Each step forward exuded his confidence and the composure of a true leader. Alongside him, Gillian advanced with the same air of authority. He casually ran a hand through his hair before speaking in a deep, measured voice, asking how much longer they intended to make them wait. Ghislaine halted, his sharp gaze fixed ahead, his cold voice cut through the air, ordering the lesser men to scatter and summon their commander. From the shadows, a lazy voice responded. A burly man emerged, stretching as though he had just woken up. He nonchalantly asked what all the commotion was about. The mercenaries stirred uneasily, their hushed murmurs and the clinking of weapons betraying their growing anxiety. From the front lines, another figure stepped forward. His calm demeanor was underpinned by a commanding presence, each step echoing with deliberate intent. Introducing himself in a cold tone, he declared that he was Kaor, the captain of the Cerberus mercenaries. Kaor stopped, locking eyes with Ghislaine. His deep voice resonated as he demanded to know the purpose of the meeting. Behind him, the Cerberus troops stood poised, ready to charge at a single command. Facing Kaor directly, Ghislaine spoke with unwavering clarity, stating his intention to assign them a mission. Kaor raised an eyebrow, his cold gaze scrutinizing the young noble. With a touch of sarcasm, he remarked on the disrespectful manner in which Ghislaine treated his subordinates. Stepping forward, Kaor's tone turned mocking as he questioned whether a noble like Ghislaine shouldn't have better manners. Ghislaine responded with a faint smile, his sharp eyes meeting Kaor's. He explained that this was his way of greeting Kaor, believing it was the most effective method of subduing him. Kaor's lips curled into a derisive smile. Amused, he remarked on the humor in Ghislaine's notion of subjugation. Shaking his head lightly, his gaze glinted with a teasing edge as he added that he couldn't imagine what a second greeting might entail. With a calm gesture, Kaor signaled for him to proceed. He sat down on a wooden chair, his eyes wary yet expectant. Ghislaine, his expression sharp, answered concisely, the beast forest. Kaor's brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Behind him, the mercenaries reacted visibly, startled by the audacity of the request. Ghislaine maintained his icy stare, meeting Kaor's gaze directly. His voice remained firm as he declared his intention to hire the Cerberus mercenaries for the task of exploring the beast forest. The mercenaries behind Kaor erupted into whispers, their voices laced with astonishment. Some exclaimed in disbelief, questioning if Ghislaine truly intended to explore the beast forest, infamous for its deadly creatures, and wondered if it was the same forest near Perdium's borders. Kaor's lips curled into a sly smile, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. Leaning forward slightly, his voice dripped with mockery as he questioned what kind of person Ghislaine was to stir up such a dangerous place. Standing tall, Ghislaine met Kaor's gaze with unshakable confidence. He declared himself as Ghislaine Perdium, the young lord of Perdium. Kaor remained seated, his cold eyes fixed on Ghislaine. A hint of surprise flickered across his expression, but he said nothing, silently assessing the young noble before him. For a moment, silence enveloped the room before the mercenaries behind Kaor broke into a flurry of chatter. One of them spoke up loudly, exclaiming that Ghislaine must be the young lord they had heard so many rumors about. Another laughed nervously, calling him crazy for wanting to explore the beast forest, a place no sane person would dare approach. Kaor's mocking smile deepened as he addressed Ghislaine in a tone dripping with sarcasm. He remarked that a pampered noble raised in a sheltered mansion clearly had no idea about the true dangers of the beast forest. It was not a place for someone so inexperienced and naive. Ghislaine's expression hardened, and he slammed his hand against the table with enough force to reverberate through the room. His cold gaze bore into Kaor as he cut him off sharply, declaring that he needed to hear no more from him. Kaor leaned back in his chair, a disinterested look crossing his face. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he ended the negotiations, his voice cold and commanding. He signaled his men to act, and the mercenaries behind him immediately drew their swords, ready for combat. Ghislaine sat down calmly, his eyes reflecting a thoughtful intensity. Beside him, Gillian stood firm, gripping his axe tightly, his sharp gaze sweeping over the room, ready for any sudden attack. Kaor leaned forward, his sharp gaze fixed on the young noble, silently daring him to falter. The weight of his question hung in the air as he asked if Ghislaine was afraid. Ghislaine's response was calm yet cutting, a faint smile playing on his lips as his eyes sparkled with derision. He remarked that despite their reputation as a skilled group of mercenaries, the Cerberus mercenaries seemed to be nothing more than overhyped rumors. As his words echoed in the room, a sudden thud broke the tension. Kaor slammed his boot onto the table, the force reverberating like a shockwave. The action spoke louder than words, asserting his dominance and disrupting the suffocating silence. Settling back in his chair, Kaor rested his feet arrogantly on the table. His demeanor exuded smugness as he casually remarked that he avoided trouble unless it promised clear rewards. His tone carried a warning, though his eyes betrayed a subtle challenge. Across from him, Ghislaine's cold gaze never wavered. The young noble's lips curled into a smirk as he dismissed Kaor's reasoning, labeling it as an excuse for the weak to avoid their responsibilities. The tension between the two grew heavier, an unspoken challenge brimming beneath the surface. Kaor's composed facade began to crack, irritation flickering in his expression. Instead of retaliating with anger, he let out a derisive laugh, belittling Ghislaine as someone so insignificant that killing him wasn't worth the effort. He demanded a sum of money to let the matter drop, insisting Ghislaine leave immediately. Ghislaine remained unshaken, his resolve unyielding. He declined Kaor's demand outright and declared his purpose for being there to issue a formal challenge. The boldness of his declaration reverberated through the room, leaving everyone present momentarily stunned. Kaor's sharp gaze bore into Ghislaine as the young noble stepped forward with unwavering determination. The tension in the room reached a crescendo as Ghislaine invoked the recognition of Moriana, an ancient and revered right among mercenaries. Kaor's demeanor shifted slightly, his surprise evident despite his composed exterior. He questioned whether Ghislaine truly understood the gravity of what he was invoking. Ghislaine's expression remained resolute, his voice steady and confident. His reply made it clear that he knew exactly what the challenge entailed. The recognition of Moriana was no ordinary test. It was a sacred trial among mercenaries, one that demanded more than physical strength. It tested courage, honor, and the very will to survive, making it a challenge reserved only for the most daring. In the brutal ritual known as the recognition of Moriana, two combatants agreed to stake their honor in a deadly duel. They would fight within a confined circle, armed only with short knives and without the use of mana. One of their arms would be bound, forcing them to rely solely on their strength and cunning in a space where every movement carried life or death consequences. Stepping out of the circle meant instant defeat, leaving no choice but to confront the opponent head-on. For many, the winner often did not emerge unscathed, and in some cases both combatants met a grim fate. The duel was not merely a test of strength but a ruthless tradition that demanded the utmost resilience and skill. Ghislaine Perdium, the young lord of Perdium, stood before the mercenaries with an icy gaze. When his challenge was issued, silence fell over the room. The tension was palpable, sharp as a blade, as if the very air held its breath. The loser will kneel, admit their defeat, and submit unconditionally to the victor's command. His voice rang out clear and commanding like an undeniable decree. One of the mercenaries whispered in disbelief, his expression confused. He questioned how a noble like Ghislaine could possibly know about such a brutal tradition. In their minds, the mercenaries understood one unspoken truth in their world: refusing such a challenge was tantamount to admitting weakness, a disgrace no one could afford. Kaor, the leader of the mercenaries, couldn't hide his disdainful smile. His voice dripped with mockery as he asked if Ghislaine truly understood what Moriana entailed, suggesting that such a cruel gamble was unfit for someone like him. Ghislaine's lips curved into a smirk, his gaze sharp as a blade. Without hesitation, he affirmed that he knew exactly what it was, and that he had no fear. Leaning back in his chair, Kaor let out a cold laugh, offering to assist Ghislaine in his endeavor. The mercenaries laughed in unison, their voices dripping with scorn. Yet none of them noticed the unwavering determination in Ghislaine's eyes, a quiet strength that promised he would see this through to the end. As the rope was tied tightly around Ghislaine's wrist, the duel began. No magic, only a single knife and the confines of a small circle. Stepping out of bounds meant instant defeat. Death often claimed both the victor and the defeated in battles like these, yet Ghislaine showed no hesitation. Kaor's eyes lingered on the young noble standing opposite him, a flicker of curiosity mixed with disdain evident in his gaze. Ghislaine entered the combat ring, his sharp eyes unwavering and resolute. The rowdy cheers of the mercenaries surrounded him, but his composure remained intact, exuding an unmistakable air of arrogance and self-assurance. Across from him, Kaor made no effort to hide his intent to humiliate the young noble who dared to challenge him. "So, you claim to know the rules of Moriana and still had the audacity to challenge me?" Kaor sneered, his tone dripping with derision. "There's no way out for you now." The mercenaries' shouts grew louder, their excitement for the impending duel palpable. Yet, in contrast to the crowd's frenzy, Ghislaine stood calm and collected, his unwavering gaze locked onto Kaor as though he were sizing up a wild beast soon to be tamed. In a low voice, Ghislaine responded, his tone carrying an air of quiet authority. "Because I've completed this method 5 times before." Kaor grasped Ghislaine's hand firmly as the rope was fastened between their wrists. The tension in the air was suffocating. This simple gesture marked the start of a life-and-death duel, where only one would leave the circle alive. Ghislaine's expression remained icy, his voice cutting through the charged atmosphere as he countered Kaor's words with chilling confidence. 5 times? I've done this over 400. Kao smirked, his eyes gleaming with a hint of defiance. He coldly remarked that he had performed this ritual 5 times, as if trying to crush his opponent's spirit. However, Ghislaine simply curled his lips into a faint smile and responded calmly, stating that he had done it more than 400 times. Before Kao could react, Ghislaine closed the distance between them, his piercing gaze fixed on his adversary. Kao let out a roar, unable to tolerate the overwhelming confidence emanating from Ghislaine. A commanding voice shouted, "Begin," signaling the start of an intense battle. The two clashed immediately, their daggers flashing in the dim light. Ghislaine launched a swift attack, striking directly at Kao, forcing him to raise his blade in defense. The force of the blow was immense, driving Kao a few steps back. Kao retaliated with a swift slash aimed at Ghislaine. However, the young man deftly dodged and spun around to counterattack. Ghislaine's sharp eyes stayed locked on his opponent, analyzing every move with unwavering focus. The battle continued fiercely as the two exchanged a flurry of attacks and counterattacks. Kao caught sight of Ghislaine's calm but commanding expression, feeling the pressure of his precise and decisive movements. In a lightning-quick motion, Ghislaine lunged forward and thrust his dagger toward Kao. Kao reacted just in time, raising his weapon to block. The sharp clang of clashing metal echoed through the air. The combatants moved fluidly, their strikes relentless. Ghislaine maintained the upper hand, pressing forward with powerful attacks, while Kao retreated strategically, seeking an opening to strike back. Kao suddenly spun around, attempting to use brute force to throw Ghislaine off balance. Yet, Ghislaine swiftly dodged and exploited the opening, driving his dagger toward the exposed area Kao had left undefended. Kao gritted his teeth, enduring the blow. In a desperate moment, Kao seized Ghislaine's arm, yanking it forcefully in an attempt to regain control, but Ghislaine remained unshaken. His cold eyes bore into Kao, readying himself for the next counterstrike. Kao swung his fist with a strength so intense it seemed to shake the air around them. Ghislaine ducked just in time, evading the attack by a hair's breadth. He immediately retaliated with a swift dagger strike aimed directly at Kao, unyielding in his determination. Kao gritted his teeth and quickly retreated to avoid the strike, but Ghislaine didn't give him a moment to regain his balance. With a swift turn, Ghislaine slashed his dagger from an unexpected angle, forcing Kao to block with his free hand. the rope binding their hands stretched taut, forming a limiting barrier yet failing to hinder the relentless attacks. Ghislaine seized the opportunity, using the rope to yank Cao toward him. The sudden force caused Cao to stumble, struggling to maintain his footing. Without hesitation, Ghislaine delivered a powerful kick to Cao's side, causing his opponent to falter. Cao clenched his jaw, bracing against the impact, and swung his dagger directly at Ghislaine. The young man quickly stepped back, his gaze steady and unwavering. Cao smirked mockingly, his eyes alight with provocation. He remarked that Ghislaine was tougher than he had anticipated, but his disdain was evident as he sneered at the claim of completing Moriana's ritual hundreds of times. Not letting up, Cao lunged forward and threw a heavy punch toward Ghislaine. He taunted, jeering that if Ghislaine intended to fabricate stories, he should at least make them believable. Cao's punch carried significant force, creating immense pressure, but Ghislaine remained calm, biding his time for a counterattack. The mercenaries standing nearby erupted in cheers, rooting for Cao as they noticed Ghislaine gradually losing his advantage. A few shouted loudly, calling for the death of the audacious noble who dared to challenge them. The air buzzed with tension, the boisterous cheers threatening to drown out Ghislaine's resolve. From a distance, Gillian, his silver hair gleaming under the dim light, watched the battle intently. His eyes were contemplative, and his furrowed brows betrayed his effort to assess the situation. Around him, soldiers stood rigid, their gazes sharp and focused. Gillian exhaled quietly, murmuring to himself that this was a battle with no chance of victory. His somber expression, however, couldn't completely hide the worry etched onto his face. The battlefield was confined within a narrow circle, just large enough for one person to lie down. Strict rules prohibited the use of mana or external resources, forcing both fighters to rely solely on their physical strength. The rope binding their hands further restricted movement, adding to the grueling difficulty of the match. Ghislaine struggled to evade and block Cao's relentless strikes. His movements became increasingly sluggish, while his opponent capitalized on every opportunity to gain control and dominate the battle. Cao continued his assault, step by step forcing Ghislaine into a defensive position. The overwhelming strength and pressure of his attacks left Ghislaine exerting every ounce of effort just to avoid being completely overpowered. From a distance, the older man Gillian observed the scene with sharp, calculating eyes. His hand rested on the hilt of his sword, ready to intervene should the situation spiral out of control. If things escalated beyond recovery, he was prepared to end the fight himself. Amid the escalating tension, Ghislaine seized a chance to turn the tide. Utilizing the rope binding their hands, he yanked Cao forcefully toward him, throwing his opponent off balance. Cao tried to steady himself, but Ghislaine moved swiftly, locking Cao's arm in a firm grip. Using the momentum from his pole, Ghislaine spun and drove Cao to the ground with impressive strength. The unexpected maneuver left Cao sprawled on the floor, reversing the situation entirely. Ghislaine quickly jumped back, lowering his stance to maintain balance after the powerful move. His sharp eyes locked onto Cao's every movement, keenly anticipating the next action. As Ghislaine planted his feet firmly on the ground, a sharp pain shot through his arm, the same one he had used to block Cao's earlier attacks. With no mana to shield him, the force of Cao's strikes had taken its toll. He clenched his teeth, determined not to let the pain distract him, his calm demeanor unshaken. Ghislaine reflected briefly, realizing that if the fight continued in this manner, his injuries would only worsen. Yet, instead of hesitating, he stepped forward with resolve, ready to launch a powerful counterattack and reclaim the upper hand. Cao burst into loud laughter, his eyes gleaming with mockery as he looked at Ghislaine. He commented on Ghislaine's pale face, sarcastically asking if the young man had reached his limit. The smug grin on Cao's face only intensified the pressure in the battle. He pressed on with relentless attacks, each strike more forceful than the last. Cao taunted that Ghislaine looked pitiful as he struggled against the overwhelming strength before him. Every blow carried weight, pushing Ghislaine further into a defensive stance. Despite his mocking tone, Cao threw in a backhanded compliment, acknowledging that Ghislaine was the bravest noble he had ever encountered. However, he quickly added that such bravery amounted to little more than a fleeting impression. Cao's lips curled into a self-satisfied smirk, his cold gaze piercing as if to unravel Ghislaine's thoughts. He declared with confidence that he could see through Ghislaine's strategy entirely. Analyzing his opponent's movements, Cao remarked on how Ghislaine relied on his weapon to block or evade strikes while absorbing lighter blows with his body. He reminded Ghislaine that the Moriana ritual forbade the use of mana, meaning the accumulated injuries would soon drain his strength. The continuous impacts left visible marks on Ghislaine's body, making it increasingly difficult for him to maintain balance. Cao smiled knowingly, clearly exploiting this to drive Ghislaine further into disadvantage. Cao stared at Ghislaine with icy eyes, unable to conceal his twisted sense of delight. He declared that the pressure was bearing down on Ghislaine's legs, something evident in his opponent's strained expression. His smirk grew even more provocative. Cao relished the sight of Ghislaine struggling against the inevitable, finding genuine enjoyment in watching his opponent's futile resistance. Ghislaine tightened his grip on the rope, his eyes burning with determination. A crimson aura seemed to ignite around him, reflecting his unyielding fighting spirit. Cao could laugh all he wanted, but Ghislaine was ready to turn the tide. Cao spun sharply, his hands moving swiftly as he prepared a powerful strike. The blades in his grasp gleamed under the light, radiating a sense of imminent danger. He lunged forward, thrusting his body weight forcefully into Ghislaine. The precise and powerful attack made Ghislaine stagger, forcing him to dodge as best he could while still being cornered. Cao followed up immediately, driving a punch straight toward Ghislaine's face. The sheer force of the blow shook the air around them, forcing Ghislaine to brace himself. However, Cao's overwhelming strength left him unable to counterattack right away, keeping him momentarily on the defensive. Cao spun swiftly, driving his knee forcefully into Ghislaine's stomach. The impact made Ghislaine falter, his breath labored from the pain. Yet his gaze remained steady, unwavering in its resolve. Ghislaine attempted a counterattack, sending a straight kick toward Cao. However, Cao was quick to catch his leg, rendering the strike ineffective and stopping it mid-air. Without hesitation, Cao retaliated with a powerful punch to Ghislaine's side. The sound of the impact echoed sharply, accompanied by a searing pain that coursed through Ghislaine's body. In response, Ghislaine's icy eyes glinted with determination. He delivered a forceful kick aimed directly at his opponent. The sheer strength of the attack seemed to ripple through the air, a red glow flickering faintly around his foot. Cao smirked, his expression exuding triumph as his eyes glinted with a sense of assured victory. He declared the fight over, his arrogance evident in every feature of his face. Raising his dagger high, Cao's voice cut through the night like a blade as he prepared to end it. The knife gleamed ominously in the air as he shouted, "Die!" The surrounding mercenaries roared with excitement, their cheers growing louder as they watched the red-haired warrior seize control of the battle. From the sidelines, Gillian called out a warning, his voice steady but firm, "Be careful, Ghislaine." Despite his severe injuries, the young noble maintained a cold smile. His grip tightened on his blade, the sharp edge reflecting a fiery determination that refused to yield. Cao moved without hesitation, plunging his dagger downward with lethal intent. Ghislaine twisted his body to evade the attack, but the ropes binding his hands restricted his movement. A deep gash opened on his shoulder, and blood began to drip onto the arena floor. Cao stared at Ghislaine, surprise flashing in his eyes as he realized his opponent had dodged the fatal blow in an unexpected maneuver. His brow furrowed slightly, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Taking advantage of the moment, Ghislaine spun with precision, using the momentum from his evasive move to pull Cao closer. Each counterstrike from Ghislaine flowed like an unstoppable current, turning the tide of the battle and leaving Cao struggling to keep up. Cao's sharp eyes shifted quickly as he detected something unusual among the mercenaries. A fleeting look of confusion crossed his face as he noticed their worried expressions, highlighting an impending sense of danger. Swinging his dagger forcefully, the blade slashed through the air, heading straight for Ghislaine. The young noble swiftly tilted his body, narrowly dodging the attack, with the blade passing just inches from his face. Cao followed up with an onslaught of rapid strikes, his dagger slicing left and right, cutting through the air with terrifying speed. Ghislaine turned his body just in time, evading what could have been a fatal blow. Spotting a small opening in Cao's attack, Ghislaine countered with a powerful thrust, driving his dagger into his opponent's side. A scream of pain echoed through the arena as blood spilled onto the floor, yet the red-haired mercenary's eyes still burned with unrelenting madness. The surrounding crowd erupted in chaos as they saw their captain wounded again. Many were visibly shaken by Ghislaine's extraordinary combat skills. One of the mercenaries exclaimed that the nobleman was far too skilled, forcing their captain to struggle in a way they had never witnessed. Another shouted, demanding that the captain prove himself worthy of being a true mercenary. Despite the noise, the captain remained silent, his icy gaze filled with unyielding determination. Ghislaine pivoted sharply, delivering a powerful punch to Cao's chest. The force caused Cao to stagger momentarily, though he quickly regained his footing. The air was filled with the sound of shouts and the whistle of blades, the tension in the battlefield thickening with every second. Seizing an opportunity, Ghislaine lunged forward like lightning, dagger in hand, aiming to bring the fight to an end. His fist connected squarely with Cao's face, leaving his opponent momentarily stunned. The rope binding their hands grew tighter as Ghislaine pulled back, widening the distance and preparing for the next strike. Raising his dagger high, Ghislaine's gaze was resolute, filled with an unshakable determination. The blade gleamed under the dim light as he poured all his remaining strength into a decisive attack. The dagger plunged into Kao's arm, blood spraying across the arena. Ghislaine felt the resistance of his opponent's flesh but pressed harder, unflinching. Kao's scream of agony echoed through the air, freezing the atmosphere on the battlefield. Roaring in fury, Kao retaliated with a massive punch, but Ghislaine held his ground, unwavering even in the face of such overwhelming strength. Kao's face flushed red with frustration as he gritted his teeth and demanded to know how Ghislaine could still stand after barely holding his own moments before. From the sidelines, Gillian observed silently, his eyes glinting with understanding. A slight nod of his head suggested he had grasped something that everyone else had yet to realize. Kao's relentless strikes caused his muscles to tighten, gradually robbing him of flexibility. Each swing of his blade became heavier but carried immense force, forcing his opponent to brace himself under the pressure. In contrast, Ghislaine refrained from meeting the attacks head-on. Instead, he skillfully utilized the momentum of Kao's blows, relaxing his body and redirecting the flow of the fight to his advantage. Observing the situation closely, Gillian couldn't hide his surprise. The older man noted how Ghislaine cleverly used strategy to overcome the disparity in physical strength. His hand instinctively tightened around the axe at his side, his thoughtful gaze hinting at the calculations forming in his mind. The mercenaries in the background grew increasingly restless, dissatisfied with seeing their captain outmaneuvered. One of them shouted angrily, frustrated by their inability to intervene. Ghislaine acknowledged Kao's determination, commenting that most others, when cornered, would abandon the rules and resort to mana to escape. Kao, his voice filled with both confidence and defiance, responded with a sneer, stating that Ghislaine sounded as if he had truly experienced the Moriana ritual hundreds of times. He emphasized that it was this very adherence to discipline that had earned him the position of captain. Kao declared that in a world like theirs, breaking the rules would ensure one's downfall. With a faint smile, Ghislaine's eyes gleamed with admiration as he admitted Kao's dedication was commendable. Despite the apparent disadvantage in their physical confrontation, Kao's calm and confident gaze hinted that the outcome of this battle was far from decided. His half-smile, full of determination, carried a hint of challenge as he growled that victory wasn't solely about strength. His calculating eyes sparkled as if formulating a surprise move. As the fight continued, Ghislaine narrowly avoided a powerful slash from Kao's blade. Despite his effort to evade, a gash opened on his arm and blood dripped steadily onto the ground. The arena rules were repeated aloud. Stepping outside the circle with even 1 foot would result in immediate disqualification. Ghislaine summoned all his strength to maintain his position, while Kao relentlessly pushed to force him out. Kao shouted that no matter how skilled Ghislaine was, being thrown out of bounds would seal his fate. His self-assured grin conveyed his confidence, as if the victory was already his. With a triumphant roar, Kao declared his impending victory. His eyes burned with determination and self-satisfaction, his expression exuding the belief that he had already secured the win. A firm hand gripped the hilt of a dagger, its blade gleaming sharply under the pale light. It was the only weapon Ghislaine held in this grueling battle. Seizing an opportunity, Ghislaine bent low and surged forward with pinpoint accuracy. His lightning-quick movement forced his opponent to step back, startled by the sudden surge of power. Kao retaliated with a powerful toss, sending Ghislaine airborne. Both combatants maintained their grip, but the sheer force of Kao's throw disrupted Ghislaine's balance, leaving him vulnerable. Locked together mid-air, the red-clad warrior quickly gained the upper hand. Kao exerted direct pressure, tightening his hold and asserting dominance, forcing Ghislaine into a defensive struggle. Fingers clenched tightly around the arm bound by ropes, the tension stretched to the brink as though the limb might snap. The tightly wound ropes added to Ghislaine's pain, amplifying his disadvantage. Summoning all his strength, Ghislaine delivered a heavy punch aimed at his opponent. The strike surged forward, but Kao, with sharp reflexes, maintained his composure and dodged with a swift spin. Ghislaine used the momentum of Kao's evasion to close the distance, locking his opponent's arm in a firm grip. The explosive power radiating from both fighters seemed to shake the very air, yet Ghislaine held onto his advantage. With a decisive, powerful blow, Ghislaine ended his counterattack. Kao was slammed onto the ground with resounding force, the impact echoing across the arena. Although Kao tried to maintain his cold demeanor, the tension on his face betrayed the gravity of the moment. The knights surrounding the battleground froze in disbelief, their gazes fixed on the fight. One of them gasped, pointing out that Kao had been pushed out of the circle. A hush fell over the crowd as the realization sank in. The battle's outcome had been decided. Blood streaked down the face of the fallen combatant, his wide eyes filled with shock. Kao lay motionless, defeated and consumed by disappointment. Murmurs and sighs rippled through the spectators. Everyone understood that the result was clear. The match was over, and the victor had been determined. Ghislaine stood tall, his icy gaze locked onto Cao. A faint, confident smile crossed his face as he calmly declared his victory. Cao, his body battered and bruised, could not conceal his astonishment. Struggling to lift his head, he stared at Ghislaine and muttered in disbelief, asking how someone like him could possess such extraordinary skills. Ghislaine didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering and resolute. With calm authority, he reminded Cao that he was speaking to his future master, and such improper behavior would not be tolerated. The two warriors charged at each other once more, their strengths clashing in a fierce display of raw power and agility. Cao tightened his grip on his opponent's arm, striving to regain control and turn the tide. Breaking the silence, Cao spoke with a mixture of patience and curiosity. "What do you want?" "The fight is over." His voice carried a hint of exasperation. Ghislaine responded calmly, his eyes glinting with challenge. "No, you haven't stepped out of the circle yet." His words struck Cao like a bolt. Shocked, Cao gritted his teeth and barked, "What?" The tension soared as the realization dawned on everyone. Ghislaine's sharp, unwavering gaze remained fixed on his opponent. With an air of finality, he declared that he would personally deal with his subordinate from now on. His voice was steady, commanding, yet composed, leaving no room for doubt about his resolve. Ghislaine delivered a decisive punch to his opponent, sending blood spraying from Cao's face. His cold, determined gaze reflected his dominance in the battle, leaving no doubt about who held the upper hand. Using his strength, Ghislaine forced Cao down onto the arena floor. The circle of warriors surrounding them stood in stunned silence, their eyes wide with disbelief at the scene unfolding before them. Cao panicked, shouted in desperation, invoking the rule that stepping out of the circle meant defeat. But his cries only betrayed the hopelessness in his eyes, underscoring his powerless state. Another punch from Ghislaine landed squarely on Cao's face, too fast and forceful to be avoided. Blood splattered with each precise, devastating strike, showcasing Ghislaine's sheer power and skill. Bending down, Ghislaine stared coldly at his pinned opponent, his voice chilling as he questioned Cao's understanding of battlefield rules. In pain and humiliation, Cao tried to argue back, but his weakness was laid bare for all to see. Ghislaine's eyes hardened further, his tone unyielding as he issued a stark warning. He reminded Cao that as his rightful master, defiance was not an option. With unwavering resolve, Ghislaine clenched his fist and delivered another crushing blow to Cao's face. Blood sprayed again as Cao groaned in agony, his teeth gritted in a futile attempt to endure the relentless onslaught. Ghislaine showed no signs of stopping. Each successive punch was powerful and relentless, as if he intended to crush every ounce of resistance left in his opponent. Their guttural cries echoed through the arena, creating a brutal and chilling spectacle that left onlookers trembling. The guards watching from the sidelines exchanged nervous glances. One asked quietly if this was acceptable, while another murmured that the fight had technically ended. Yet none dared to step forward and intervene as Ghislaine maintained his overwhelming dominance, proving his unmatched strength. Without hesitation, Ghislaine raised his fist and delivered another blow to Cao's already battered face. Cao cried out in pain, pleading for it to stop, but the blood pouring from his wounds made it clear how dire his condition had become. Before Cao could even think of retaliating, Ghislaine swiftly locked his wrist and yanked him forcefully, throwing him to the ground. The arena floor, now marked with blood and the scars of battle, bore testament to the ferocity of the clash. Ghislaine's icy eyes bore into Cao, his voice steady but laced with a challenging tone. He reminded Cao that the match was not yet over, further intensifying the pressure on the defeated man. Cao's gaze flared with sharp defiance, his emotions boiling beneath the surface. The tension etched across his face was unmistakable, a reflection of the inner turmoil that consumed him. Cao roared, his bloodied face twisted with hatred as he directed a fiery glare at Ghislaine. He shouted a command to his men: "Kill him." The mercenaries began to stir, their movements creating an atmosphere thick with danger. The soldiers responded in unison, their synchronized footsteps echoing ominously as they gripped their weapons tightly, ready to charge toward Ghislaine. From the rear, the heavy blade of a battle axe gleamed as it was unsheathed, its weight and presence instantly commanding attention. The warriors in the ranks froze, their eyes widening with alarm at the unexpected intervention. The tension thickened as they recognized the power wielded by the one holding the weapon. A strong, authoritative voice cut through the chaos, warning that anyone interfering with the young lord's act of discipline would pay with their lives. The chilling finality of the words froze everyone in place. The speaker was none other than Ghislaine. The older man stood firm, his stance unwavering as he gripped the axe in his hands. The dim light reflected off the blade, casting a menacing glow that seemed to envelop the battlefield. It felt as though the entire scene had been caught in the calm before a storm. The silver-armored mercenaries hesitated, their resolve shaken. The powerful aura emanating from the ongoing conflict caused them to step back in silent apprehension. Cao panted heavily, his face streaked with blood and his eyes unfocused as he struggled to comprehend what had just transpired. He muttered incoherently, his voice laced with pain and defeat. Blood seeped from the corner of his mouth, mingling with his labored breaths. Delane remained composed, his icy gaze piercing through Cao's defenses. In a deep, commanding tone, he asked whether Cao was ready to concede. Cao let out a dry, mocking laugh, the sound filled with scorn, as if to provoke Ghislaine further. Ghislaine's hand tightened into a fist, the tension reflecting his simmering anger. His expression remained calm, but the restrained fury was unmistakable. Delane drove Cao back with a series of powerful punches, each strike a clear declaration of his dominance. Meanwhile, Cao's mind was clouded with disdain as he recalled every noble he had ever encountered: weaklings, failures, and spineless fools who lacked any true strength. He thought bitterly of those he had faced in the past: arrogant swine, traitors, and self-absorbed braggarts. Each face resurfaced in his memory, reminding him of why he fought to rise above them. Cao had relied on intimidation to crush his opponents, forcing them into submission through fear. Afterward, he would gleefully strip them of their wealth, finding cruel amusement in their humiliation. These brazen actions had earned him the title Mad Dog, a name that inspired both fear and loathing, ensuring no one dared underestimate him. Now Ghislaine stood tall, his piercing gaze fixed on Cao, who lay helpless at his feet. Cao couldn't fathom how he had ended up in this position, facing defeat at the hands of someone he deemed a cowardly noble. The surrounding mercenaries panicked, their voices trembling as they shouted for guidance from their captain. Yet none of them knew how to act as they watched their leader falter. Ghislaine, maintaining his cold composure, grabbed Cao's limp arm and raised it slightly, his eyes sharp with challenge. He thought silently to himself, wondering if this humiliation was sufficient. Without breaking his calm demeanor, Ghislaine turned toward the nearest soldier and pointed, his tone steady but commanding. "Bring water, bandages, and cloth," he ordered. His voice wasn't loud, but the weight of authority it carried left no room for defiance. He continued, his expression emotionless: "If you don't act quickly, your captain will die." His grip on Cao's arm remained firm, a silent yet unmistakable reminder of the situation's gravity. The soldiers froze momentarily, their eyes widening at the stark warning. Then, spurred into action, they scrambled to follow his orders. The clinking of armor betrayed their haste and nervousness as they moved with urgency under Ghislaine's command. The battlefield was damp, the tension in the air palpable. Ghislaine maintained his grip on Cao's bound arm, his demeanor unwavering. From behind, the cold, watchful gaze of Gillian added to the pressure. Though the older man said nothing, his eyes conveyed a mixture of respect and cautious observation, as if silently acknowledging the shift in power. Scanning the battlefield, Ghislaine issued his orders with a tone of unyielding authority. The unruly mercenaries, known for their defiance and insolence, unexpectedly fell in line under the command of the young lord. Their movements became increasingly disciplined, reflecting the commanding presence Ghislaine exuded. In the world of mercenaries, where laws held no sway, power reigned supreme. Ghislaine's fists had etched that reality deeply into their minds, leaving no room for doubt about his dominance. With eyes blazing with determination, Ghislaine made it clear to everyone who the true ruler was. The image of a massive wolf with glowing eyes loomed metaphorically over the field, a symbol of unstoppable authority. The wolf had finally bowed. There was no disputing Ghislaine's position. He was the master, the irreplaceable leader of the pack. Inside the dimly lit tent, Cao sat before a wooden table, his gaze fixed on the document laid out in front of him. Behind him, knights clad in iron armor stood silently, their presence adding to the oppressive atmosphere. Cao's eyes lingered on the paper as Ghislaine pointed firmly at it, his voice cold as he ordered Cao to sign the document before him. Cao remained silent, his lips pressed into a tight line. He shifted his gaze from the paper to Ghislaine, seemingly weighing his options in the tense silence that enveloped the room. Everyone around waited, holding their breath for Cao's next move. After a moment, Cao tightened his jaw and cast a frosty glare at Ghislaine. Grudgingly, he picked up the pen, his movements heavy with resentment, and began to write, as though forcing himself to comply. Ghislaine's icy gaze remained fixed on Cao as he tilted his head slightly and asked in a clipped tone, "Here?" Cao hesitated, lowering his head as a flicker of reluctance crossed his face. After a brief pause, he murmured that he hoped to work well with Ghislaine from this point forward. His voice carried a mix of fear and reluctant respect. Ghislaine smirked coldly, his lips curling upward slightly before he abruptly gripped Cao's arm tightly. His voice was sharp and final as he stated, "Good." Sitting upright with an air of decisiveness, Ghislaine declared that, from this moment onward, they were a family. The atmosphere in the tent grew heavy, and all eyes turned toward him with a newfound sense of reverence. Fixing his gaze on Cao, Ghislaine let a faint smile play on his lips. In a steady, unchanging tone, he remarked that he, too, looked forward to their cooperation from now on, yet his icy stare betrayed no warmth, maintaining the same cold resolve that had brought him victory. A few days later, in the outskirts of the Perdium territory, the majestic landscape of towering mountains unfolded. A grand castle nestled deep within the valley radiated an aura of authority and mystery. In the assembly area, soldiers gathered in large numbers. Their polished armor gleamed under the sunlight as they exchanged curt remarks. The clinking of weapons filled the air as they made final preparations. Many gazed ahead, their expressions tense and vigilant. One soldier yawned loudly, grumbling about being summoned so early in the morning. He muttered that being called out at dawn was inconvenient, especially since he hadn't even had breakfast to brace himself for the day. A tall man with a calm demeanor addressed the group, informing them that their new master was the son of the Perdium family. One of the soldiers gasped in surprise, his face betraying skepticism. Another scoffed, dismissing the young lord as just a boy, doubting his ability to manage this band of mercenaries. A one-eyed soldier smirked slyly, murmuring that this mission might turn out to be easier than expected. Yet, beneath his smile, a flicker of silent caution glinted in his eye. Suddenly, a sharp clap resounded through the area, capturing everyone's attention. The man responsible swept his gaze across the crowd, and the weight of his presence heightened the tension in the air. Stepping forward with a self-assured grin, a burly man declared a challenge. He emphasized that dealing with a young master like this required someone to represent them. The crowd murmured among themselves until one of them exclaimed in recognition. The man was none other than Gordon, famously known as the Muscle. Gordon stood tall, puffing out his chest as he confidently proclaimed himself the representative they needed. With a laid-back attitude, he mocked the group for their reluctance to take initiative and praised his own dedication. Shifting to a stern tone, Gordon reminded the mercenaries that without unity, no plan could succeed. He referenced a prior failure when an ill-advised demand by a fool had ruined everything. The gathered soldiers nodded quietly, some sighing as they recalled the disaster. Facing an imposing figure across from him, Gordon held his ground, his fearless demeanor unwavering. The other man, cold and unfazed, fixed his icy gaze on Gordon and demanded curtly, "What do you intend to do?" Gordon, the towering figure, smiled confidently as he placed an empty pouch on the table. He announced that he would represent the group in pressuring their employer, demanding fair compensation for his efforts. His expression implied that everything would be resolved smoothly under his guidance. One of the soldiers nodded in agreement, stating that with Gordon as their representative, things would surely go well. They praised his muscular physique, claiming it made him the perfect choice for situations like this. Coins began to fill the pouch, accompanied by compliments on how Gordon, despite spending all his time training, still managed to earn money so effectively. Suddenly, Gordon turned sharply at the sound of an approaching announcement, his face betraying a moment of caution. He lifted the pouch slightly, his sharp gaze scanning the surroundings as he ordered everyone to be ready. In the distance, the outline of a rider emerged through the dusty road, steadily approaching the camp. The rhythmic sound of hooves echoed, signaling the arrival of someone significant. As the rider drew nearer, their imposing figure became clear, adorned in armor with a cold, steely gaze. The magnificent castle in the background only heightened the air of authority surrounding them, causing the camp to fall silent in anticipation. The soldiers watched closely, one of them furrowing his brow as he scrutinized the approaching figure. He confidently remarked that judging by the attire, it was likely their employer. Another soldier scoffed dismissively, joking that once the newcomer saw Gordon's strength, they'd turn tail and flee. Standing tall, Gordon barked orders, his booming voice commanding everyone to move forward and create an intimidating atmosphere. The mercenaries eagerly gathered, their eyes glinting with excitement as they prepared to carry out his commands. With a smug expression, Gordon clapped his hands sharply and smirked. He declared that it was time to teach the young lord a harsh lesson about the realities of the world. The echoing sounds of his declaration only added to the tense atmosphere. Yet, as the sound of approaching hooves grew louder, Gordon's brows knitted together in confusion. An inexplicable unease crept into his mind, a feeling he couldn't quite shake. The silhouette of the rider loomed closer, accompanied by the steady, deliberate rhythm of hooves. The air fell silent except for the increasingly distinct sounds of the approaching party. Emerging from the haze, a group of cold, stoic figures came into view. At the forefront was Ghislaine, his icy gaze fixed ahead, flanked by a retinue of formidable warriors. Their procession exuded an overwhelming aura of authority and menace. Though no words were spoken, the threat they carried was unmistakable. One of the mercenaries gasped as he recognized the distinct dog-shaped helm worn by the approaching soldiers. He nervously whispered his suspicion that this might be the infamous Cerberus mercenary company. Gordon, standing nearby, appeared equally stunned by the turn of events. Ghislaine's gaze swept across the soldiers in the camp, a flicker of confusion crossing his otherwise impassive face. He wondered silently what had driven these reckless fools to submit so readily to their new master. Ghislaine's group advanced in a tight formation, with him leading on horseback. Opposite them stood Gordon and his men, their tense expressions betraying their unease as the inevitable confrontation drew closer. As they approached, Ghislaine silently studied the burly man before him, his face betraying no clear emotion. Without preamble, Ghislaine's cold voice broke the silence, asking the man if he was the designated representative. Caught off guard, Gordon stammered, attempting to maintain his composure as he confirmed his role. Ghislaine's tone remained calm, but his sharp gaze cut through the tension as he demanded the man's name. Gordon hesitated briefly, his nerves evident as he introduced himself as Gordon the Muscle. His voice quivered slightly, exposing the anxiety he felt in the presence of the young noble. Ghislaine repeated the name with faint surprise, his piercing eyes scrutinizing Gordon. He hadn't expected someone like him to be the chosen representative of the mercenaries. Smirking with mockery, Ghislaine dryly complimented Gordon's name, calling it cool. But without warning, he swung his arm, delivering a powerful punch to Gordon's stomach. The sudden blow left Gordon gasping in pain, doubling over as the crowd around them froze in shock. The stark contrast between Ghislaine's composed demeanor and his swift, decisive action filled the air with tension and unease. Standing tall and unwavering, Ghislaine's voice rang out clearly as he declared to the crowd that he was none other than Ghislaine Perdium, heir to the Perdium family. His words left the gathered mercenaries stunned, their murmurs dying out as silence fell over them. Wasting no time, Ghislaine turned back to Gordon and issued a command to assemble the mercenaries. His voice, though steady and measured, carried undeniable authority, jolting Gordon into immediate compliance. With his sharp eyes fixed on the horizon, Ghislaine addressed the group once more, his tone brimming with confidence and determination. He announced that from this moment forward, they would begin their mission to explore the monster-infested forest. The weight of his words set the stage for the challenges ahead, solidifying his position as their unquestioned leader. The lush green canopy intertwined with sunlight created a tranquil yet vibrant atmosphere. The faint chirping of forest birds heralded the beginning of a new day. Ghislaine emerged from the large tent, accompanied by a woman dressed in a black cloak. Both adjusted their armor, preparing for a significant mission. The air was filled with seriousness, reflecting their unwavering determination. With a steady gaze fixed ahead, Ghislaine reviewed everything. Once satisfied, he confirmed that all was ready for their journey into the forest. His words carried confidence, inspiring the entire group to prepare for the upcoming expedition. The construction of the temporary camp began immediately. Soldiers and expedition members worked tirelessly, each contributing their best efforts to ensure everything was completed according to plan. After the camp was set up, necessary resources were mobilized. The search teams executed their tasks swiftly and efficiently, gathering essentials for the long exploration ahead. Finally, Ghislaine reorganized his troops. From a high vantage point, his sharp eyes scanned the ranks of soldiers, ensuring all was in order. His red cloak billowed in the wind, symbolizing unshakable resolve and authority. Standing beside the key members of the group, Ghislaine observed the well-arranged formation of soldiers below. The atmosphere was filled with solemnity and determination, readying everyone for the challenges to come. Ghislaine turned to Belinda and calmly requested her to double-check the head count. She nodded in agreement, her eyes showing a hint of fatigue but remaining focused. Belinda reported that there were currently 148 mercenaries contracted through the office. She emphasized that their presence was a crucial factor for the success of this expedition. Belinda continued, noting that in addition to the others, there were 41 Cerberus mercenaries personally brought by Ghislaine. Altogether, the group now comprised 192 members, including all personnel. Ghislaine nodded slightly, his gaze filled with determination as he prepared for the journey ahead. He confirmed that everything was in order. His cold eyes stared forward, as if bracing himself for the challenges awaiting them. Ghislaine turned to Belinda, asking if she had thoroughly briefed Scoven. Belinda replied in a calm tone, explaining that she had expected Scoven to object. However, he had instead assisted in ensuring the group would remain undetected when entering the monster forest. She reassured him that, given Scoven's role as the garrison commander, they had little to worry about. A faint smile crossed Ghislaine's face as he listened to Belinda's explanation. To him, Scoven's support brought much-needed reassurance in an otherwise precarious situation. Edge with a gesture, Ghislaine signaled for everyone to assemble. The soldiers quickly formed ranks, ready for orders. The atmosphere turned solemn, the only sound being the rustling of the forest wind. He looked ahead, his voice commanding and clear. Ghislaine declared that before them lay the monster forest, a perilous land they were about to venture into. His words sharpened the focus of the entire team. Ghislaine went on to describe the potential dangers lurking within the forest, from monstrous creatures to unknown threats. Despite the risks, he asserted their resolve to conquer this treacherous land, his gaze radiating fierce determination. A murmur spread through a group of mercenaries upon hearing the name Monster Forest. Fear and unease crept into their expressions, with some doubting whether survival was possible in such a hazardous place. Belinda's sharp eyes flashed as she sternly reprimanded those disrupting Ghislaine's speech. Meanwhile, Ghislaine remained composed, his unyielding gaze betraying no hint of uncertainty. Ghislaine slowly offered a choice to anyone unwilling to proceed with the dangerous mission. At the same time, he promised triple the pay for those who completed the task. The mercenaries buzzed with excitement at the mention of the reward. One of them shouted in surprise, his enthusiasm renewed by Ghislaine's bold promise. Belinda, however, felt uneasy hearing the plan. She silently pondered how the funds allocated for the journey had already been exhausted. Meanwhile, Ghislaine maintained his calm demeanor, explaining that this was his way of boosting morale. With confidence, Ghislaine stated that if the mission succeeded, he would have more than enough to pay everyone handsomely and still have funds left over. The image of glowing crystals symbolized his certainty and well-thought-out strategy. Ghislaine smiled, his eyes filled with unwavering confidence as he looked at his comrades. He asked gently but with undeniable assurance whether Belinda trusted him. The calmness in his voice exuded a commanding presence that inspired those around him. Belinda sighed softly and nodded. Though she remained silent, she knew she had no choice but to place her trust in Ghislaine. Lowering her gaze, she tried to conceal her lingering anxiety. Behind them, two soldiers stood observing. Cao smirked faintly while Gillian remained silent, staring ahead with a thoughtful expression. Kaor remarked that Ghislaine's promise of triple pay was audacious, though he couldn't help but be curious about how it would be fulfilled. The elder Gillian responded with a steady tone, asserting that Ghislaine always had a plan, a quality that gave them greater confidence in the mission. The army gathered in full force within the monster forest. The soldiers exchanged determined glances, a unified resolve evident in their expressions as their commander shouted the battle cry. They awaited the signal to begin the mission. Ghislaine took the lead, his red cloak billowing as he commanded the group to march forward. His eyes burned with determination, showing no hesitation despite the perilous nature of their task. The forest was dark and foreboding. Towering ancient trees stretched skyward, their dense foliage casting a cold, shadowy atmosphere. An eerie silence enveloped the area, as though every creature had gone quiet in the presence of the advancing army. The first swing of the axe struck a massive tree trunk, the sharp crack of breaking wood echoing through the forest. The mercenaries quickly dispersed, forming a defensive perimeter around the campsite. They busied themselves restoring order while remaining vigilant for any potential threats. Ghislaine stepped forward, gripping his axe tightly, bracing himself for the inevitable battle ahead. When a tree came crashing down, the loud creaking and snapping of wood drew everyone's attention. Ghislaine looked up, his gaze meeting the light filtering through the treetops with a sense of satisfaction. He silently noted how the light would make their work easier. Raising his hand, he directed the soldiers to continue clearing the designated path. He instructed the group to cut the trees into sections and load them onto carts, while those without assigned tasks were ordered to dig around the roots to facilitate easier removal. Reflecting on a journal detailing the development of the monster forest from his past life, Ghislaine realized the immense size and untapped potential of the land. He resolved to eradicate the monsters and exploit every resource the forest had to offer. Marking the quickest route to the runestone vein on his map, Ghislaine focused entirely on his most critical objective, ignoring all other distractions. Swinging his axe at a towering tree, he thought about how the wealth from this expedition would be the key to thwarting the conspiracy threatening the Perdium family. The red-haired youth, Cao, gazed ahead with a doubtful expression, questioning whether his master truly intended to involve himself in this endeavor. Nearby, a soldier clad in armor spoke with a mocking tone, grumbling that the actions of nobles were merely for show, a performance to display their dignity only to give up sooner or later. Belinda's voice rang out sharply, her anger unmistakable as she commanded the soldiers to stop gossiping and focus on their work. Some quickly complied, though their sluggish attitudes remained evident. Observing the group, Belinda silently chastised them, thinking, "These fools are such a nuisance." Her brows furrowed and her gaze carried unmistakable discontent. She approached Ghislaine and asked, "Master, after all the effort spent hiring these people, why are you working yourself like this?" She explained that his actions were causing the soldiers to lose respect for his authority. Ghislaine offered a faint smile and responded calmly that having more hands would ensure faster progress. He emphasized that lingering in this place any longer would bring no benefits. Belinda sighed and conceded, adding with a hint of curiosity that it was almost as if Ghislaine had foreseen everything before coming here. Meanwhile, Kaur turned to the elderly Gillian and remarked, "The master has a young lady worrying about him. How enviable. Meanwhile, some of us are nothing more than dogs for others, willingly walking into hell." Hearing this, Gillian's temper flared. With a loud yell, he grabbed a piece of wood and hurled it at Kaur, shouting, "What was that? You looking for a fight?" The commotion drew the attention of Galinda, who turned to see the two men squabbling. Ghislaine, unfazed by the disturbance, mused silently that everything was proceeding smoothly. He recalled the efforts of Duke Delphine, who had once conquered the kingdom and established a new dynasty, initiating a large-scale campaign to develop the monster forest. Though Ghislaine still didn't understand why this location was chosen for development, he felt fortunate to have discovered a journal. The book detailed the region's valuable resources and the ecosystem of its monsters, providing him with a solid foundation to prepare thoroughly. Below, a soldier questioned the master's decision to bring along hundreds of lanterns, wondering aloud why torches, a cheaper option, weren't used instead. The forest remained unnervingly quiet, an eerie stillness that left Ghislaine feeling uneasy. Around him, the mercenaries stayed busy cutting down trees and clearing the path. Ghislaine reflected that his knowledge of the forest was limited to what he had read in the journal, things he had yet to witness firsthand. He reminded everyone to stay vigilant, warning them to be prepared for anything that might happen. The forest grew darker and more enigmatic as they ventured deeper, its atmosphere heavy with mystery. The soldiers tirelessly chopped away at the trees. The sound of axes biting into wood echoed sharply, tearing through the surrounding silence. One soldier glanced upward, wondering aloud how the sky had darkened so quickly. His companion responded skeptically, remarking that it was strange how no monsters had shown up in such a dangerous forest. A mercenary scoffed, expressing amusement at the triple pay they were promised for what seemed like such an easy job. He smugly noted how smoothly everything was going without the need for Gordon's interference, dismissing the forest's dangers as mere rumors. Suddenly, the mercenary wearing a round helmet froze at the sound of a voice from behind, saying, "Give me back my money." His face twisted in confusion as he turned around, his doubtful eyes scanning for the source of the voice. Another soldier called out to his comrades with a tone of cautious urgency. Those nearby quickly turned, their expressions serious as they awaited an explanation or warning. A burly man, standing ahead, nodded as he spoke, pointing out that they had chopped down countless trees on their way to this spot. He emphasized his point with a firm gesture, as if to underline the truth of his statement. The bald man shrugged reluctantly, admitting with a tone of mild resignation that the statement was true. Nearby, another soldier silently observed, his face thoughtful and slightly pensive. A chilling, mysterious atmosphere spread across the area, as if foreshadowing something unusual about to unfold. The burly man grumbled, questioning why the path ahead was blocked. His face showed clear frustration, burdened by the heavy log he carried on his shoulder. The nearby soldiers turned their heads toward the obstruction. The mood grew tense, and the faint flicker of firelight cast nervous shadows on their faces. A voice rang out, strong and commanding, immediately drawing everyone's attention. It was Ghislaine, issuing an order for the group to focus on an important matter that lay ahead. The army marched deeper into the forest, their synchronized footsteps breaking the silence, signaling their readiness to face the challenges awaiting them. A young soldier gasped in alarm, voicing his unease as the air around them grew oppressive and unnaturally tense. His companions exchanged anxious glances, their own fears barely concealed. Ghislaine turned back, calling out Gordon's name sharply. He warned that if Gordon stayed where he was, death would be inevitable. Surprised, Gordon froze momentarily, but the seriousness in Ghislaine's voice quickly snapped him into understanding. Ghislaine's eyes locked on Gordon, his tone firm as he reminded him to move forward cautiously, taking slow and deliberate steps. Gordon nodded, hastily gripping the heavy log on his shoulder more tightly. Step by careful step, he advanced, his movements deliberate under the cold, looming presence of the forest's towering trees. As Gordon maneuvered through the path, the log on his shoulder unexpectedly collided with a nearby tree, producing a sharp, dry thud. Startled, Gordon let out a small exclamation as he steadied himself, his surprise evident. Gordon charged forward with the massive log on his shoulder, the thunderous noise echoing through the forest, as if shaking the very ground beneath him. Each step sent tremors rippling through the earth. Two soldiers standing in formation exclaimed in shock at Gordon's reckless actions. One muttered angrily under his breath, calling Gordon a fool. Suddenly, Gordon realized the peril of his situation. His face turned pale, his eyes widened, and a panicked scream escaped his lips. In that moment, regret was etched deeply into his features. A towering tree loomed ahead in the dim, eerie light, its twisted branches bathed in a faint glow. Exhausted, Gordon slumped against the gnarled trunk, his breath heavy as he recovered from narrowly escaping danger. The group of soldiers formed a tense circle, their worried eyes fixed on the path ahead. One of them murmured, noting that something felt deeply wrong. The unease spread among them, thickening the already oppressive atmosphere. Their leader, silent and composed, observed the situation with a contemplative gaze. Though he said nothing, his calm demeanor radiated resilience, reassuring the team in the midst of uncertainty. The bald man spoke up, his voice tinged with irritation. He gestured dismissively, scoffing at the rising tension, claiming it was all unnecessary drama meant to frighten them. As he continued gesturing and raising his voice, an unexpected tremor shook the ground right before him. His eyes widened in astonishment, his expression betraying a mix of shock and helplessness as he grasped the sudden shift in the situation. One soldier, his face frozen in terror, was pulled into a swirling vortex of darkness. A scream of despair pierced the air as his body plummeted into a hidden abyss. A massive tree root, blackened and grotesque, emerged from the shadows. Its branches stretched out like spectral claws, radiating an aura of deadly menace. From the depths of the earth, a gaping maw lined with razor-sharp teeth erupted. Without warning, it swallowed the soldier whole. The predator disappeared as swiftly as it had appeared, leaving no trace of its victim. The ancient trees ahead suddenly trembled violently, their massive trunks splitting open with loud cracks, forming an unnatural fissure. No one could predict how they might move or what might emerge from them. In that moment, from deep within the crevice, a giant glowing red eye appeared, emanating a sinister aura. This was a creature that left no room for mistakes. Any lapse in caution could mean certain doom for anyone facing it. A solitary figure quietly stepped forward. His red cloak billowed behind him, and a gleaming sword rested firmly in his hand. Without hesitation, he prepared to confront the looming threat head-on. Monstrous creatures emerged from all directions, shattering the eerie stillness of the forest. The grotesque branches of twisted trees stretched outward, seemingly ready to consume everything in their path. The group of soldiers screamed in terror as they spotted the towering monsters closing in. The burly man shouted in desperation, his face pale with fear as he attempted to flee. Panic swept through the group like wildfire, with soldiers scattering in all directions. Someone yelled at the top of their lungs, warning that they would be devoured alive if they didn't escape immediately. The overwhelming dread turned the scene into a living nightmare. From the shadows, the monsters unleashed blood-red tentacles, piercing through the air with terrifying force. The space around them seemed to rip apart, emitting a bone-chilling sound that reverberated through the forest. Gordon's panic deepened as he found himself caught in the chaos. Without warning, one of the crimson tentacles wrapped tightly around him, lifting him high into the air. Other soldiers suffered the same fate, their screams echoing as they were ensnared and dragged toward their doom. The captured soldiers were hurled into gaping, razor-toothed mouths hidden within the forest floor. Their cries of despair were cut short as they were swallowed whole, the horrifying sight intensifying the suffocating atmosphere. The monstrous trees rose even higher, their enormous forms launching lightning-fast attacks with deadly precision. Their glowing red eyes shone like beacons amidst the chaos, amplifying the terror. Gordon cried out for help as a monstrous tree wrapped a branch around him, holding him tightly. His face was a mask of pure fear as he struggled helplessly against the relentless assault. A comrade shouted urgently, instructing Gordon to hold on so they could rescue him. Axes slammed against the monstrous tree's trunk in a desperate effort, while others swung their swords to assist. The battle against the overwhelming force of the creature reached an unprecedented intensity. The soldier swung his axe with all his strength, aiming directly at the vine. To his shock, the blade bounced back, leaving the vine completely unharmed. Stunned, he couldn't comprehend how it could be so resilient. He tried a few more desperate strikes, but the results didn't change. Mumbling in panic, he questioned aloud why the vine seemed as if it possessed a life of its own, refusing to break under his assault. Gordon, entangled by the vine, watched the soldier with growing worry. The futility of their efforts etched helplessness into their faces as precious time slipped away, leaving them unable to escape the perilous situation. With a violent tug, one of the tree's massive branches hoisted Gordon into the air. He cried out in pain, his voice echoing through the forest. Below, his comrades called his name in desperation, powerless to help as they watched in horror. Suddenly, Ghislaine emerged from the shadows, the light of his great sword glowing brilliantly in his hand. He advanced steadily, prepared to face the lurking monstrosities. With a decisive slash, Ghislaine aimed directly at the monster's eye. His blade struck true, severing the vine that held Gordon captive. Gordon fell to the ground with a thud, gasping for breath as the radiant glow of Ghislaine's sword illuminated the surrounding forest. Ghislaine's white hair flowed behind him as he pivoted smoothly, his gleaming sword arcing through the air. A streak of blue light trailed from the blade, slicing through the darkness toward its target. The warrior's sword collided with the massive creature, unleashing a burst of radiant light. The giant monster, its crimson eye glowing with rage, let out an ear-splitting roar. Yet the light pierced straight through its enormous form undeterred by its cries. Gordon collapsed onto the ground, trembling from the sheer force of the attack. Beside him, the white-haired warrior stood firm, his grip unwavering on the glowing sword. His cold gaze remained fixed on the colossal beast, exuding an unshakable resolve. One of the soldiers shouted in panic, exclaiming that the leader had struck down the monster and speculating that their weakness might lie in their eyes. The surrounding soldiers, though gripped by fear, struggled to steady their nerves. Amid the darkness, a voice filled with authority cut through the air, ready to rally the group. The leader, Ghislaine, yelled loudly, commanding everyone to remain focused and keep their spirits high. Despite their initial panic, the soldiers began to regain some courage, fueled by his resolute words. Ghislaine instructed the group to tighten their formation and raise their shields, creating a strong defensive line to block the incoming vine attacks. He emphasized that scattering would only make them easier targets for the creatures. He continued to issue orders, urging the soldiers to maintain their defensive stance and await further instructions. The group responded in unison, their voices resolute, demonstrating their loyalty and resolve to follow their commander's lead. The soldiers quickly assumed a defensive formation, covering all angles to fend off the vine's relentless assaults. One of them cried out, vowing not to die amidst the chaos. Ghislaine leapt down to inspect the cart carrying the oil barrels. He called out for a status report, and Kaor replied confidently, assuring him that everything was ready. Without hesitation, Ghislaine ordered the oil barrels to be lit and hurled toward the monsters. One of the team members, observing the preparations, realized the true purpose of bringing such a large supply of oil. As they worked, a panicked voice rose from the group, warning that the monsters had begun to focus their attention on them. The tension in the air thickened instantly. Ghislaine's command rang out, firm and decisive, driving everyone to act swiftly. His words carried an urgency that left no room for hesitation. The warriors hurled the blazing oil lamps at the monsters in unison. The flames burst to life, illuminating the forest and igniting a sense of determination. The fierce glow transformed the atmosphere into one of tense but unyielding resolve as they pressed forward with courage. The flames roared to life, the light from the oil lamps illuminating the forest as they scorched the monstrous creatures. Everyone held their breath, watching intently, hoping the fire would vanquish the towering beasts. Oil lamps were hurled through the air, their bright flames briefly streaking across the darkness. However, the monsters swiftly deflected them with their crimson tentacles. Sparks scattered across the ground, leaving the creatures unharmed. One of the warriors exclaimed in shock, realizing the oil lamps were ineffective. Another let out a frustrated sigh, lamenting that this method couldn't defeat the beasts. The monsters, seemingly enraged, unleashed terrifying roars that echoed throughout the forest. Their glowing red tentacles struck the ground with violent force, as if aiming to crush the warriors. Faces pale with fear, the group braced themselves for the sudden assault. A blade glimmering with cold blue light tore through the air at incredible speed, cutting through the darkness with a radiant, powerful streak. Gillian, the tall, resolute man, turned and swung his sword with precision. Each sharp slash cleaved through the approaching vines, sending dark, viscous blood spraying in every direction. The scene was a chaotic and brutal display of determination against overwhelming odds. Nearby, the white-haired woman gripped her weapon tightly, her eyes burning with resolve. She dashed forward, the steel glinting from her claw like blades as she prepared to strike down anything in her path. Belinda unleashed a sharp strike, her blade glowing with blue light as it slashed directly into the monster's eye. The force of her attack caused a burst of light, tearing apart the flesh surrounding the creature's eye in a violent explosion. Ghislaine, ever composed, issued commands without taking his eyes off the battlefield. He ordered Gillian and Belinda to prepare the oil lamps for another assault while protecting the Cerberus mercenaries. Both responded immediately, their readiness apparent as they prepared to act without hesitation. A pale blue sword was raised high, its light reflecting brilliantly in the air. Ghislaine stood face to face with the colossal monster, the glowing blade in his hand shining fiercely. He made the decision to draw its attention, readying himself for the next battle. Belinda cried out in alarm, desperately warning her young master to stay vigilant against the looming danger. Without hesitation, Ghislaine turned and lifted his sword, preparing to deliver a powerful counterattack. Every movement he made was precise, deliberate, and filled with unwavering resolve. He swung the blue glowing sword toward the monster, creating a sharp, arcing slash. His decisive movement signaled his readiness to confront the destructive force before him. Two monsters, their crimson eyes burning with rage, roared ferociously as they unleashed dark tentacles. The appendages lashed out violently, aiming to tear apart anything in their path. With a ferocious strike, Ghislaine's blade tore through the monstrous tentacles in a wild, chaotic assault. The warrior threw himself into the battlefield, dodging and countering with lightning speed, leaving his enemy struggling to respond. The monstrous tree exhaled bursts of scalding heat as it writhed from the onslaught. Its eyes narrowed with fury as it prepared a retaliatory strike. The group of soldiers gasped in horror as they realized the tree-like monster could move. One of them shouted in terror, exclaiming that these weren't just trees, they had legs. Panic spread, heightening their fear. Ghislaine tightened his grip on the glowing sword, its blue light intensifying. He readied himself to charge into the fray, his determination to destroy the creature unshakable. With a sharp, deliberate swing, the commander's sword cut a blazing arc through the air. The blue light cleaved through space, meeting the monster head-on. The powerful strike tore into the monster's eye, causing an eruption of light. The surrounding blood vessels burst violently, spreading chaos across the battlefield. Meanwhile, the soldiers behind Ghislaine watched anxiously. They were astonished to see the entire horde of monsters redirect their attention toward the commander, ignoring the rest of the group entirely. Belinda shouted loudly, ordering everyone to throw all the oil lamps at the monsters. Her voice was firm, and her eyes burned with determination. The oil lamps were hurled into the air, soaring forward like tiny fire stars. Everyone hoped that this strategy would finally turn the tide. The lamps landed among the dense vines, triggering a massive explosion. Flames spread rapidly, burning through the vines and weakening the monster's strength. The air was thick with tension, but a glimmer of hope flickered among the group. The fire surged, consuming the monstrous trees. They shrieked in agony, writhing helplessly in the expanding inferno. The intense heat made the atmosphere suffocating and oppressive. Two warriors nodded resolutely, grinning with confidence as they watched the flames overpower their enemies. They quickly began preparing more oil for another assault. Commander Ghislaine gave the order to continue throwing oil lamps. His commanding voice echoed across the battlefield, urging his comrades to focus on their mission. The fire wasn't strong enough to finish off all the monsters, and they couldn't afford to stop now. The flames engulfed the monsters, their screams of pain reverberating throughout the battlefield. The entire forest of monsters was swallowed by the raging fire. The grotesque tree-like creatures were gradually reduced to ash, and the area glowed red like the furnace of hell itself. The soldiers stared at the scene before them, both amazed and incredulous. One murmured that they never imagined they could fight back against the monsters so effectively. Another soldier, his face etched with worry, voiced his concern. He asked if the entire forest would burn down at this rate. His unease was palpable as the fire continued to spread uncontrollably. Gordon, with an exhilarated expression, burst into loud laughter and remarked that the monsters were nothing to fear. He confidently stated that trees were naturally weak against fire, so their victory was inevitable. Commander Ghislaine, exuding an air of authority, ordered the formation to hold steady and warned against losing vigilance. His voice carried a weight that demanded attention, and his determined gaze restored focus among the soldiers. One of them, surprised, murmured in disbelief, questioning if something worse still awaited them. Ghislaine firmly declared that the true form of their enemy was about to reveal itself. His unwavering eyes were filled with caution and readiness, leaving no doubt about his words. The entire area was suddenly enveloped in a thick white fog, obscuring everyone's vision. Amid the chaos, the man in the red cloak stood steadfast, unshaken. The soldiers looked around in confusion. One of them nervously asked if the smoke was steam, while another wondered aloud if the fire had been extinguished. Doubt and unease were evident in their faces. The subordinates of the blonde-haired man called out in panic, worried about the unfolding situation. Ghislaine remained calm, his expression cold as he turned to face the enemies approaching through the mist. Belinda, the white-haired woman, glanced at him with uncertainty and asked what was happening. Ghislaine explained calmly that while the monster's outer shells were vulnerable to fire, their interiors were far from easily destroyed. He continued, detailing that the fire burning through their outer layers was now reaching the moist flesh inside, causing massive amounts of steam to rise. The dense smoke and vapor blanketed the battlefield, turning it into a murky and disorienting scene. From within the thick fog, a colossal shadow emerged. The sound of labored breathing, combined with a pair of glowing, menacing eyes, sent chills down the spines of everyone present. The soldiers froze, realizing the grave danger that was now upon them. The grotesque creatures slowly revealed themselves, their twisted forms lining up as if preparing for a massive assault. Their bodies shuddered, and ferocious roars echoed through the battlefield. The commander and his warriors immediately went on high alert. Sinister flowers bloomed from the monsters, their eerie blue light radiating from the center, a clear signal that a counterattack was imminent. One of the soldiers shouted in disbelief, staring at the bizarre creatures still standing. Their grotesque appearance left him questioning his own eyes. "They're still alive?" he exclaimed, his trembling hands gripping his sword tightly. Delane raised his sword high, its glow radiating with an aura of authority. His voice cut through the chaos as he called for everyone to regroup, pointing ahead as he prepared them for the next confrontation. The red-cloaked warrior held his sword toward the sky, signaling the army behind him to ready their weapons. The light emanating from his blade served as a rallying cry, inspiring everyone to stand firm. With steady resolve, Ghislaine stepped forward and swung his sword powerfully, leaving a brilliant blue streak of light trailing along the ground. He declared to his comrades that from this point forward, the battle would be one of close combat. Ghislaine charged ahead with incredible speed, his cloak billowing in the wind. His piercing eyes locked onto the target as he shouted, "Charge!" The resounding cry stirred his comrades, driving them forward to join him in the impending clash. Ghislaine raised his sword high. A brilliant blue light radiated from the blade, illuminating the sky. His commanding voice echoed, ordering all soldiers to lift their weapons and prepare for the upcoming battle. He stepped forward, his red cloak billowing with each determined stride. The glow of his sword traced across the ground, leaving behind a long, gleaming streak, a signal that the brutal fight was about to begin. Ahead, monstrous creatures gradually emerged from the thick, swirling mist. With a firm tone, he declared that from this moment on it would be a true close combat battle. Without hesitation, Ghislaine charged forward. His sword shone brightly in his grip, his entire body like an arrow piercing through the battlefield. His red cloak fluttered violently as his sharp gaze locked onto the enemy. He drove his blade straight into the ground, slicing through the air with a powerful strike. In front of him, the giant monsters unfurled their grotesque, flower-like appendages, ready to counterattack. The soldiers behind him tensed at the sight. Some instinctively took a step back, unable to hide their unease in the face of these colossal beasts. One burly warrior gripped his shield tightly, sweat dripping down his forehead. He muttered under his breath, struggling to believe that they had to fight these creatures in close range. Another soldier, eyes wide with fear, murmured that this battle was far from easy. A single stomp from these monsters could crush them in an instant. The Cerberus mercenaries sprang into action. Leading them was Cow. He shouted, declaring that this was the moment they had been waiting for. Behind him, the other soldiers unsheathed their weapons and quickly joined the fight. From a distance, Belinda cried out in alarm, urging her young master to be careful. Her voice trembled with concern as she watched Ghislaine dive deeper into the monster's encirclement. Gillian turned sharply. His cold gaze swept over the hesitant soldiers. His voice rang with authority, demanding to know what they were waiting for. His words were a command, a push that jolted them into immediate action. Ghislaine's sword sliced through the air. A flash of blue light burst forth as his blade plunged deep into the colossal creature. From afar, Gillian, his silver hair gleaming under the battlefield's glow, spoke in a steady, unwavering tone. He reminded them that this was Ghislaine's order. All they had to do was trust him. The soldiers stood frozen, their eyes wavering between fear and hesitation. The burly warrior tightened his grip on his shield, sweat trickling down his face as he grasped the gravity of the situation. After a brief silence, he clenched his teeth and shouted that there was no other choice. He trusted that Ghislaine would handle it, and all they had to do was follow orders. The entire unit responded, raising their weapons and charging into battle. Ghislaine lifted his sword high. A brilliant blue light flashed, radiating power across the battlefield. His voice rang out, reminding everyone that the monster's outer shells had already been burned away. Now, they could be easily defeated without the use of magic. He declared that there was nothing to fear. Cow smirked arrogantly, his eyes gleaming with excitement. He scoffed that the creatures were now nothing more than giant training dummies, nothing to worry about. His tone was sharp as he commanded the troops to eliminate every last one of them. The battlefield erupted. Swords clashed, weapons swung, and the air filled with the monstrous roars of dying creatures. The relentless assault tore through the enemy ranks. Blood and lifeless bodies covered the ground, but the warriors pressed forward, fighting without rest. Ghislaine surged ahead, his sharp gaze unwavering. To him, hesitation meant death. With his glowing sword in hand, he lunged at the massive creature before him. His red cloak billowed behind him, and his blade shone with fierce radiance. He knew his duty was to erase any trace of doubt from those who followed him. The sword pierced through the monster's mouth, sending dark blood splattering in all directions. The sharp edge ripped through flesh, delivering a single, decisive strike that ended the beast. Ghislaine raised his sword once more. A violet light burst forth as he prepared to face the next colossal creature charging toward him. His cold eyes burned with determination, his stance firm, exuding an unshakable battle spirit. He stood tall amid the chaos, his sword glowing like a beacon in the darkness. To him, a leader's duty was not just to give orders but to instill courage in his subordinates to make them believe that the impossible could be achieved. Around him, monstrous giants encircled the battlefield, forming a deadly trap. Ghislaine and his warriors stood at the center, ready to face the next wave of attacks. The burly warrior gasped for breath, his eyes widening as he surveyed the battlefield littered with fallen creatures. He murmured in disbelief, struggling to accept that they had wiped out every last one. The other soldiers nodded in agreement. Their exhaustion was evident, but so was their exhilaration. The soldiers remained stunned, their heavy breaths merging with the cold air around them. Some exchanged glances, struggling to accept the reality of their victory. Ghislaine stood at the front, his cloak shifting slightly as he commanded the troops to regroup. His voice was firm, leaving no room for anyone to lower their guard or lose focus. The soldiers quickly formed ranks, standing steady under their commander's imposing gaze. Scattered across the battlefield, monstrous corpses lay lifeless. Yet, Ghislaine pressed forward, leading his army with unwavering resolve. The battlefield was littered with bodies surrounded by towering beasts. As he scanned the bloodstained landscape, he confirmed that they had entered the beast forest. Even at the outskirts, the sheer number of direst ents was overwhelming. Behind him, the soldiers couldn't hide their unease. Some wiped away cold sweat, their eyes tense as they grasped the full danger of their surroundings. There had been no time to rest, yet a greater threat loomed ahead. Ghislaine stepped forward, his steady voice cutting through the tense silence. He reassured them, declaring that there was nothing to fear. Standing tall in the midst of the battlefield, his red cloak swayed slightly in the breeze. His voice remained composed as he made it clear he would always be the one to lead the charge. He turned back, his gaze sharp yet resolute. With unwavering conviction, he demanded that they trust him and follow his lead. The entire army fell silent. Their expressions flickered between fear and determination as they absorbed his words. Then, in unison, they responded. Their voices rang out through the pouring rain, a declaration of their readiness to obey and move forward. Suddenly, a massive crystal projectile came crashing down from above. Ghislaine and the surrounding warriors recoiled, swiftly dodging the impact. But some weren't fast enough. The force of the collision sent them flying across the battlefield. From the darkness, a figure emerged, a chilling smile etched across his face. Behind him, a horde of vicious creatures loomed. Ghislaine instinctively stepped back, only to feel Belinda's steady grip supporting him. Their eyes met, filled with caution. It was clear a new threat had just revealed itself. The monstrous birds swooped down from above, their glowing red eyes burning with savage intent. A soldier let out a panicked scream as he was snatched into the air. The remaining warriors hurriedly raised their shields in defense. Ahead, a towering beast with razor-sharp fangs let out a deafening roar. The soldiers instinctively stepped back, feeling the sheer pressure of the approaching monster. The burly warrior clenched his teeth, swinging his massive mace as he roared in frustration. The creatures just kept coming in endless swarm, with no sign of stopping. Cao dashed forward, his sharp gaze locking onto Gillian. The two exchanged determined looks, silently coordinating as the chaotic battle unfolded. The mercenary swung his sword, aiming straight for the giant beast's leg. His powerful strike cut deep into the flesh, causing the creature to howl in agony and stagger off balance. A soldier cried out in alarm as the massive beast began to fall. The entire squad quickly scattered, dodging the crushing impact as the monster collapsed onto the battlefield. A cold, gleaming blade sliced through the air, descending with terrifying speed. A brilliant blue light flashed against the rain, carrying a lethal aura. The sword pierced straight through the monster's skull, embedding itself deep inside. A surge of electricity erupted from the wound, crackling across the beast's body. It let out a final agonized scream before its massive form went completely still. Ghislaine scanned the battlefield, his commanding voice cutting through the rain as he asked if anyone was injured. The surviving soldiers, breathless but still standing, quickly responded that they were unharmed. A warrior shouted, reminding his comrades that if they wanted to survive, they had to stay close to their leader. The troops swiftly formed ranks, raising their shields in unison, ready to fight. Some roared in fury, challenging the remaining monsters to their last stand. Gillian observed the troops as they gradually fell into formation. He gave a slight nod of approval, noting that their coordination had improved significantly. Beside him, the red-haired man let out a chuckle, remarking that no training method was more effective than real combat. Ghislaine tightened his grip on his sword, his gaze unwavering. He agreed with the sentiment, fully prepared to lead his soldiers forward in the brutal battle ahead. Standing at the front, his commanding voice rang out as he ordered the troops to continue clearing the path forward. The entire unit responded in unison, confirming their mission without hesitation. One soldier stood, frozen sweat dripping down his face, his wide eyes locked onto Ghislaine, filled with disbelief. He panted heavily, unable to find his voice. A surge of emotions overwhelmed him. His eyes bulged, his expression twisted with terror. Deep inside, he felt as if everything had gone beyond his limit. To him, the entire army had lost their sanity trapped in this nightmarish forest. The landscape was painted in crimson hues, scorched marks seared into the ground, remnants of the fierce battle they had just endured. The group pressed forward, weaving through the dense canopy of trees. Before them, a vast lake emerged under the moonlight, its surface shimmering with an eerie blue glow. A startled cry broke the silence. A soldier gasped at the sight of the water, unable to hide his amazement at its pristine clarity. Within moments, the others rushed forward, kneeling by the lakeside, greedily scooping up handfuls of water to drink. The relentless thirst from their grueling journey left them with no choice but to quench it without delay. Standing apart, Belinda, the white-haired girl, watched with concern. Her sharp gaze remained fixed on the darkness beyond the lake. In a serious tone, she warned that this area was dangerous. No one could predict what might emerge from its depths. Ghislaine remained composed. His cold eyes reflected unwavering confidence. He silently assured himself that they had been on the right path all along. To him, this lake was the most critical landmark on their journey to the runestone mine. Under the still night sky, the soldiers began setting up camp near the water's edge. Flames flickered in the darkness, their glow mirrored on the tranquil lake. The order was given they would rest here before continuing their journey. Under the flickering firelight, the mercenaries sat around the campfire, exhaustion etched on their faces. One let out a weary sigh, questioning what they were even doing there. Another gazed into the distance, voicing concern that they were still too close to the entrance, unable to imagine what lay ahead. A third exhaled in relief, remarking how fortunate they were that nothing had happened in the past 2 nights. Their attention shifted toward the boiling pot over the fire when someone suddenly gasped in surprise. Inside a tent, a group of mercenaries huddled together, deep in discussion. One of them whispered, suggesting they slip away from the forest while they still could. At his words, another mercenary immediately frowned and turned to Manus, demanding to know what the hell he was talking about. Manus rose to his feet, his eyes filled with calculation. He argued that there was no need to risk their lives any longer. Life, he emphasized, was far more valuable than money, an undeniable fact. Another mercenary countered, reminding the group that they had already come a long way. Their employer had assured them that the destination wasn't far, and by now they should be close. But Manus merely scoffed, mocking those naive enough to believe such promises. With a sweeping gesture, his voice grew louder. He declared that their employer, notorious as the rogue of Perdium, had never ventured into the forest for their sake. This journey was fueled by nothing more than personal ambition. A voice from the group reminded everyone that they had been paid, and following orders was their duty. Another soldier beside him nodded in agreement, pointing out that their employer wasn't just a leader, he had saved their lives on multiple occasions. One of the mercenaries crossed his arms, acknowledging that there was truth in those words. Still, he argued that their survival up until now had been nothing more than luck. No matter how strong their employer was, he was still human. A single mistake could cost all of them their lives. Another mercenary, his wild eyes gleaming, let out a twisted grin. He sneered that when the situation turned dire, they would be nothing more than human shields for that noble. A chuckle escaped him as he mocked that all nobles were the same. The burly mercenary's expression tightened, sweat forming on his brow. He remained silent for a moment before muttering reluctantly that, while there was some truth to Manus's word, behind him, a few others began to waver, uncertainty creeping into their faces. The cloaked figure smirked, recognizing their hesitation. It worked in his favor. If he were to go back alone, he would be walking straight into a death trap filled with monsters. If necessary, he would have no qualms about using these fools as bait. A sharp voice cut through the tense atmosphere. One of the soldiers fixed his gaze on the cloaked man, his eyes piercing. He pointed out bluntly that without their employer, they would have been dead long ago. Under the dim firelight, another warrior raised his hand, gesturing towards something ahead. His expression was unreadable as he urged everyone to look in that direction. Inside the camp, the young warrior Ghislaine carefully applied medicine to a mercenary's wound. His movements were slow yet precise, displaying meticulous attention to every detail. Ghislaine reminded the injured soldier to be cautious and avoid getting the wound wet, warning that an infection could be fatal. The mercenary bowed his head, his voice trembling with gratitude. Belinda, the white-haired girl, stared at the medical supplies with curiosity. She questioned why he wasn't keeping such expensive remedies for himself. Ghislaine, his blonde hair catching the fire's glow, casually replied that medicine was meant to be used in moments like these wasn't that obvious. As Ghislaine continued tending to the wounded, a mercenary hesitated, watching from a distance. The one-eyed mercenary spoke up, his voice slow and deliberate. He remarked that the medicine and supplies their employer was using on them were worth more than their lives. If he truly intended to use them as human shields, would he waste valuable resources like this? Under the flickering firelight, another soldier spoke with certainty, declaring that their employer was different from the others. Another nodded in agreement, convinced that he wouldn't abandon them. One mercenary, standing apart, remained silent, his expression thoughtful. The scheming mercenary gritted his teeth, frustrated by the old man's interference. He calculated his next move. If he couldn't persuade all of them, he at least needed to lure some away. However, the situation was not in his favor. From another side of the camp, Ghislaine's firm voice broke the murmuring. He ordered the men to stop their discussions and use the time to rest. The soldiers quickly responded in unison, acknowledging his command. Cao and Gillian listened as Ghislaine signaled that he wanted to speak with them privately. Without hesitation, both nodded in agreement. Cao voiced his doubts about letting the traitor roam free when he should have been punished. Gillian, his tone cold, stated that the man was powerless, especially with the monsters lurking all around. Ghislaine remained focused on something more urgent. There was an issue that needed immediate confirmation. When asked to count the lanterns in the area, one of the soldiers hesitated, puzzled by the request. The answer came quickly. There were currently around 24. Ghislaine observed carefully, his thoughts aligning with his suspicions. A few lanterns had disappeared. Since their arrival in the forest, monsters had attacked relentlessly day and night. Yet strangely, for the past 2 nights there had been no sign of them. Under the flickering campfire light, the warriors gradually sensed something was off. Belinda widened her eyes in realization, falling silent for a moment before voicing her doubts. Beside her, Cao remained deep in thought, his sharp gaze growing colder. They were starting to understand. The older warrior, Gillian, his thick silver beard a mark of his experience, also fell into contemplation. Ghislaine's voice turned grave as he stated with certainty they had entered the territory of a creature that hunted exclusively at night. Gillian added that it was more than just a nocturnal predator. This entity had a profound influence over the entire forest, distorting its natural balance. Ghislaine nodded in agreement, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the group thickened instantly. The night sky loomed in eerie silence. The dense canopy of trees swayed in the wind, their dark silhouettes whispering unseen threats. Staring into the ominous forest ahead, Ghislaine stood still, listening intently as an unsettling sound echoed from deep within the woods. His eyes narrowed, the flickering fire reflecting in his sharp gaze. A suffocating sense of tension filled the air as he murmured cautiously the real danger was only just beginning. Under the night sky, the dim moonlight cast a faint glow over the camp. The cold night wind howled through the tents, carrying an eerie hum that echoed in the stillness. Inside the camp, the mercenaries rested. Some lay sprawled on the ground, while others stood watch, their eyes scanning the surroundings with caution. The air was quiet, filled only with the soft crackling of embers and the steady breaths of sleeping soldiers. A towering man with bulging muscles lay at the center of the camp, arms crossed over his chest. His breathing was slow and steady. Everything seemed peaceful, but everyone knew that this silence could be the calm before the storm. His eyes flickered open, a vague sense of unease creeping over him. The dim glow from an oil lamp above cast flickering shadows, making him squint. A feeling of apprehension stirred in his chest as the lamp began to tremble slightly. He tensed, staring at it as the shaking grew more violent. In a flash, the lamp shot out of its place. His body jerked back in shock, a single question racing through his mind: why had it moved on its own? In the dim glow, another mercenary stirred, sensing something was wrong. As the lantern above started to sway, his brows knitted together, muscles tightening instinctively. Then, without warning, he sprang up as the light flickered against something shifting in the darkness. Before his eyes, the lantern suddenly lifted into the air without any explanation. His breath caught in his throat. He stumbled backward, his face draining of color as he muttered in sheer disbelief at the unnatural sight before him. Before Gordon could even cry out, a piercing scream shattered the silence. All around the camp, heads snapped toward the source of the sound. Panic spread through the mercenaries as they turned to see Gordon thrashing wildly, caught in the grip of overwhelming terror. He swung his weapon wildly, his voice raw with panic as he tried to drive the creature away. His axe cut through the darkness, slicing the air with force, but the monster had already vanished before the blade could reach it. The surrounding mercenaries stood frozen, staring in shock at the scene before them. One of them shouted, demanding to know what was happening. Gordon, still panting heavily, his face pale as a ghost, stammered that there had been a monster right beside him, but now it was gone. Under the flickering firelight, the mercenaries exchanged confused glances. One of them frowned, turning to Gordon with a skeptical look, asking what on earth he was talking about. Gordon's grip on his weapon remained firm, his muscles tense with vigilance. Yet, as he scanned the area, he realized there was nothing there. His face drained of color. His breath hitched as he struggled to process what had just happened. He muttered to himself, trying to confirm that there was truly nothing lurking nearby. One of the mercenaries let out a sigh, dismissing it as nothing more than a bad dream. He pointed out that they had faced too many monsters lately. It wasn't surprising if their minds started playing tricks on them. Gordon quickly shot back, his voice firm. It wasn't a dream. A voice rang out from the distance, cutting through the murmurs. A figure stepped forward, his expression grim. He declared that this wasn't just some random sleepwalking episode. All eyes turned to him, attention now fully locked onto the one who had spoken. The long-haired man's gaze remained cold and piercing. He stated that he had woken up because of an unusual presence, and the moment he did, he had witnessed a lantern vanish right before his eyes. And the atmosphere in the camp grew heavier. The tension was undeniable. Under the dim glow of the night, the mercenaries began to feel a creeping unease. A few flinched, murmuring that they had just heard an eerie laugh echo somewhere in the darkness. Gordon stood at the center of the gathered soldiers, confusion written all over his face. He couldn't understand why everyone was suddenly so tense. The long-haired man, his expression cold and unreadable, stated that while they didn't yet know what was happening, one thing was certain: something was lurking nearby. Outside the camp, the dense night swallowed the forest in complete darkness. The only sources of light were the flickering lanterns hanging over wooden crates. The silence was unnatural, as if something unseen was watching them from the shadows. Under the wavering firelight, a soldier suddenly turned, suspicion flickering in his eyes as he looked at Ghislaine. The cloaked man gave a faint, knowing smile, acknowledging that Ghislaine had seen through everything. The mercenaries stirred as Ghislaine stepped forward. One of them stammered, addressing him as master, his voice laced with both uncertainty and anticipation. Ghislaine halted in front of them, his sharp gaze sweeping across every face. With a firm and commanding tone, he ordered them to regroup immediately, allowing no room for hesitation. Under the pale moonlight, the once quiet camp broke into hushed murmurs. Outside the tents, dozens of soldiers gathered, their faces tense as they whispered about something unseen. Inside the tent, the commanders sat in silence, their expressions filled with suspicion and wariness. Everyone understood that something was wrong, yet no one could say for sure what it was. Gordon, his face pale, blurted out that the monsters had completely surrounded their camp. The man beside him, his expression cold and composed, calmly noted that if that were true, then those creatures couldn't be seen with the naked eye. Ghislaine maintained a calm tone, asserting that this was the natural behavior of these creatures. His sharp eyes gleamed as he concluded that they had likely been watching the group since they arrived at the lake. Before them, grotesque beings emerged from the darkness, their bodies covered in writhing tendrils and glowing red eyes. They were the hunters of the night, the true predators that ruled this forest after sundown. They were called Falors, the Shadow's relentless stalkers. A warrior tightened his grip on his weapon, his gaze filled with fear as the monstrous silhouettes closed in around them. These creatures had the ability to merge with the darkness, making them nearly invisible. Physical attacks were completely ineffective. Their numbers stretched into the hundreds, moving fluidly as they tracked their prey, extinguishing every source of light. They dragged their victims into the suffocating void, using the pitch-black night as their ultimate hunting ground. One of the soldiers widened his eyes in horror upon realizing just how many there were. His voice faltered, strangled by fear. The burly man beside him also turned pale, struggling to accept what he had just heard. The group gathered around the discussion table, suspicion evident on their faces. Someone suddenly pieced together the reason behind the disappearing lanterns. Another clenched his fists in frustration, feeling as though the creatures were toying with them before delivering the final blow. Cao, visibly agitated, proposed striking first. He argued that attacking immediately was better than allowing the creatures to control the battle. However, Ghislaine remained composed. He firmly stated that they needed to wait. Only when the monsters made their move would it be the perfect moment to counterattack. Belinda looked anxious as she pointed out that they had already lost more than half of their lanterns. Was waiting really the right decision? She turned her gaze toward their leader, silently demanding an answer. Ghislaine remained composed as he continued his explanation. He warned that attacking recklessly would only worsen the creature's savage nature. They might retreat for the moment, but they would return, causing even more trouble. If they weren't careful, they could lose their one chance to eliminate the monsters all at once. One of the mercenaries flinched, repeating Ghislaine's words in disbelief. Wipe them all out in a single strike? Beside him, the seasoned warrior Gillian stood with a grave expression. He asked if such a feat was even possible, considering they were up against hundreds of nearly invisible creatures. Ghislaine gave a firm nod. His plan was real. The enchanted talismans had already been prepared as per Belinda's request. Each mercenary had received one. Satisfied with the preparations, Ghislaine confirmed the information with a nod. Then, he declared that it was time to explain how they would fight these creatures. A heavy sword was driven into the ground with a sharp metallic clang. Ghislaine shifted his focus to the map drawn on the dirt, his voice calm and analytical. Based on his observations, the Falors had surrounded their camp from 3 different directions, slowly snuffing out the lanterns to tighten their trap. If this continued, the remaining light would be extinguished, making their situation even more dire. He continued, pointing out that their numbers were completely outmatched. Defending the entire area was impossible, especially against enemies that weren't human. A direct confrontation would only lead to them being overwhelmed, crushed from both flanks. Fortunately, by setting up camp near the lake, they had avoided being completely surrounded. The silver-haired man standing beside him gave an approving nod. Choosing this location had been a wise decision. It secured an escape route if things took a turn for the worse. Surveying the camp, Ghislaine asserted that the situation was not entirely against them. Despite being surrounded, they still held control over the battle. The others exchanged surprised glances, unable to understand how they could possibly be in control while being hunted by monsters. With his sword in hand, Ghislaine traced 3 symbols onto the ground, then laid out his strategy. First, they would divide their forces into 3 distinct groups. The defensive unit would hold the line, preparing to absorb the creature's initial assault. The crossbowmen would stand ready, waiting for the perfect moment to halt the enemy's advance. The elite assault squad, led by a warrior wielding a glowing sword, would step forward, preparing to strike. The defensive and ranged units would concentrate their forces at the center, steadily pushing the creatures back. Meanwhile, the assault team would attack from the left flank, focusing all their firepower on that side. If they could trap the creatures by forcing them toward the center, victory would be within reach. The group huddled around the map drawn in the dirt, listening intently to the battle plan. Gillian nodded in understanding, acknowledging the strategy. Meanwhile, Cal remained skeptical. He questioned whether the plan was truly feasible. Their commander, lost in thought for a moment, responded calmly it was entirely possible, as long as the central unit could hold their ground. A sharp voice from Belinda suddenly broke the moment of contemplation. She spoke with authority, reminding them of a critical fact: the Falors were unaffected by physical attacks since they could merge into the darkness. Her silver eyes locked onto Ghislaine, her arms crossed in firm determination. She repeated his own words about the creature's unique traits before posing the most pressing question: how exactly were they supposed to fight them? Tension thickened inside the tent. All eyes turned toward their leader, waiting for his response. A heavy silence followed. Everyone was waiting for Ghislaine to answer. Cal suddenly spoke up, wondering if they could use magic to counter the creatures. Ghislaine, maintaining his usual composure, reassured Belinda that there was no need to worry. He subtly mentioned the magic scrolls, implying that they had already prepared for this situation. A chilling howl echoed through the forest, as if hundreds of creatures were screaming in the pitch-black night. The soldiers immediately gathered, gripping their weapons with tense determination. One of them shouted a reminder to maintain formation and not abandon their assigned positions. But at that very moment, their last remaining lantern was snatched away. Darkness swallowed the entire camp. A voice, thick with anxiety, broke through the ranks. Something was approaching. Footsteps echoed in the suffocating silence, the faint clatter of armor sending a ripple of tension through the warriors. According to the Vanguard Journal of Delphine, there had been a clear description of these creatures. A firm hand lifted an ancient parchment high into the air. A surge of magical energy flashed across its surface. The inscription read, "We have discovered that the Falors are extremely sensitive to light." As the blinding radiance struck them, the once invisible figures lurking in the darkness began to emerge. The sharp-eyed warrior holding the parchment observed the shifting light, his gaze reflecting a knowing certainty he had found the key to overcoming the threat before them. Ghislaine clenched his fist, the glow of magic intensified around him. His voice rang with authority. It was time to act. In perfect unison, the warriors unfurled their enchanted scrolls, activating the first-tier magic circle. A blue glow expanded outward, engulfing the entire battlefield. A radiant burst of light shot into the sky, tearing through the oppressive darkness. The creatures lurking within the shadows were finally revealed. The light erupted, blazing across the battlefield, revealing the charging Falors. Their guttural roars filled the air as the intense glow struck them. Their crimson eyes flickered with unmistakable fear. A voice rang out the light. Immediately, torrents of radiant energy crashed down, drowning the creatures in the very thing they despised most. The Falors shrieked in agony, their twisted bodies convulsing as the light shattered the darkness cloaking them. They thrashed wildly, desperate to escape the searing radiance consuming them from within. The soldiers stood frozen, eyes locked onto the unfolding chaos. The darkness receded, unveiling the monstrous forms lurking within. One soldier gasped, his voice still trembling with disbelief. He had never imagined that the creatures surrounding them all this time had the elongated, slithering bodies of eels. The entire unit swiftly regrouped. A commanding voice roared across the camp, ordering everyone to prepare for battle. The enemy was closing, and killing intent thickened the air. The crossbowmen immediately took position, weapons raised. Orders came swiftly: halt the monsters' advance at all costs. The frontline warriors tightened their formation, shields locking together to form an unyielding wall. A rallying cry echoed through their ranks: hold the line for as long as possible. Ahead, the creatures screeched in fury, surging forward like a relentless tidal wave. Their razor-sharp claws tore through the air, thirsting for blood. A brutal clash was imminent. Ghislaine stepped forward, his blade gleaming under the pulsating light. His voice boomed across the battlefield: vanguard, attack. Behind him, his formidable strike force charged into battle. Belinda, Gillian, Cow, together they stormed forward, leading the charge against the darkness. This is the end. Please comment Ghislaine below if you want to do next part.